Manhattan has a way of pretending that nothing is strange if you price it high enough. Tonight, Somnolent Conspiracies opens the door to a courtroom that should have been as ordinary as a subway delay and was anything but. Settle in, listeners. Adjust the angle of your lamp. Let the city fade to its window hiss. This is your seat in the gallery. We trade in puzzles here, and we treat your attention with evidence. Clocks that skip beats, paper that remembers fingerprints longer than the skin that left them, and rooms that insist on a temperature no thermostat can explain. The case you're about to hear began with a murder that would have satisfied any precinct's appetite for cause and opportunity, until voir dire. 12 jurors were seated. None raised an objection, and yet every face in the box had already been printed in obituaries. Not lookalikes, not a trick of light. Names, dates, and death notices aligned as if the city's morgues had filed an appeal. Our narrator is a defense investigator named Evan Mora, the kind who notices the scuff behind a radiator as fast as he notices a lie. Across the aisle stands Assistant District Attorney Lila Greystone, too sharp to blink and too stubborn to flinch, even when the temperature drops 3 degrees the moment the clerk says, "All rise." Between them lies a defendant, Marcus Vale, a security consultant with no alibi and a watch that stops at the precise minute the victim's heart did. Above them all hangs justice, oak-paneled, dust-moted, and, tonight, listening. If you're new to Somnolent Conspiracies, welcome. If you're returning, you know the ritual. We follow the facts, we honor the strangeness, and we do not run from the places where the two overlap. Ready? The court is in session, and the dead have been sworn. Part 1, the box of names that should not match. The corridor outside Part 52 carried the usual courthouse perfume of paper, reheated coffee, and the wool of suits that had already seen a day before the day began. Inside the courtroom, the air was colder, the kind of cold that made you aware of your fingernails. I stood in the aisle with my folder tucked against my ribs and watched the benches take their weight. Murmurs fell into place. A clerk shuffled forms. The second hand on the clock crawled without complaint. It was all ordinary, and then it was not. Voir dire started with the practiced rhythm of a tide. The clerk called a name. The figure stood. The judge nodded. The prosecutor and defense counsel looked up and looked down. The words were familiar enough to pass as furniture. I leaned against the rail, letting the room print itself into my head. Names will tell you what the air cannot. Juror number 3, Adrian Coe. The man who lifted his hand had a straight back and the soft jawline of a runner off season. Coe. It snagged at the mind like a hook behind a wall. I had seen that name somewhere recent and not in a way that promised long tomorrows. Juror number 6, Marta Riva. Small, dark hair, face that looked younger when it was still. Riva. The same hook again. Juror number 8, Jerome Halley. Broad hands, eyes that tracked as if he were listening to a radio the rest of us could not hear. Halley. The third hook. I felt the shift behind me before I heard it. A court officer easing close enough to be private. He was the kind who had seen everything and saved most of his words for the walk home. He nodded toward the box and whispered without moving his mouth much. Didn't that guy die in May? The whisper did not name him. It did not have to. I kept my eyes on the front and slid my phone out under the folder. The signal in this room was always a little sluggish, as if it had to ask permission to cross the threshold. The search bar blinked. Adrian Coe, Obituary, New York. The first result was a newspaper that did not waste adjectives on the dead. Stroke, age 47, survived by a sister. Photo matched the jaw. My mouth went dry in a careful way. I searched again. Marta Riva drowning, Washington Heights. A short piece, a candlelight vigil photo with a string of umbrellas behind it. I searched again. Jerome Halley, Obituary, Queens, Pneumonia. A photograph with a tie and a smile that could hold a porch. All 3 within 2 years. The judge came in then. Honoria Pell. She had the posture of a woman who had worn this robe long enough to feel the weight of it as a shape rather than a burden. The clerk called all rise. The movement rustled through the room. My skin tightened the way it does when you pass from sun to shade without moving. The temperature fell a few degrees. No one else rubbed their hands. Assistant District Attorney Lila Greystone rose at her table. She did not blink more than necessary. She looked from the panel to her notes with the control of a surgeon reaching for a scalpel. On our side, Kenton Yarrow adjusted his tie and made the small smile he saved for clients when he wanted them to feel taller than the charges that brought them here. Between them, Marcus Vale sat with his shoulders squared in the way of a man who had worked security long enough to know what it meant to be watched. His watch sat in an evidence bag elsewhere. Its hands stopped at a minute that would matter. The clerk's voice was steady as a metronome. The jurors nodded at the questions, the rote recitations about bias and service. I kept the obituaries under my thumb and waited for someone to flinch. No one did. When Kenton glanced up at the box, his eyes slid across Adrian Coe as if the man were any other stranger with a civic duty. When Lila looked up, she saw 12 shapes that fit the shape of the law. The judge studied them and found what she had ordered. If there was a seam between this panel and the panels that came before, it did not show on the bench. I tried to speak to Kenton at the first lull. I had the folder open, the 3 names underlined in red, the dates aligned like teeth. I said his name. Sound came out of my mouth, but it met a pressure in my ear the way wind meets the glass of a moving car. I said his name again. He did not turn. The pressure increased, a soft glove over the side of my head. The clerk read the oath then, and the room repeated "So help you God," and there was a metallic undertone to it, a scrape under the vowel, like a knife laid flat on a table. The pressure lifted. Kenton turned toward me with a polite question in his face, and by then the oath was done and the box had been sworn. I closed the folder slowly. I have seen witnesses who lied without moving and rooms that changed their mind about where doors were. This was not that. This was a room behaving as if it had made a promise before any of us arrived. I looked at Adrian Coe, at the smooth line of his jaw, at the way his hands rested without tremor on his knees. I looked at Marta Riva, whose eyes focused like a lens set on an absent horizon. I looked at Jerome Halley, who did not seem tired or ill or any of the things that would have explained an obituary. The judge asked the parties if there were any challenges. Lila's voice was clear. None from the people. Kenton rose, buttoned his jacket, glanced at the row of faces in the box, and sat again. None from the defense. The gavel touched wood with the economy of habit. The panel was seated, 12 who had already been named in the city's small print. A new juror took the last seat. A man with a blue tie and the blank mask of someone who is there to do a good job and then go home. I waited for the cold to move again. It did not. I studied the court officer who had whispered. He kept his eyes straight, as if the ceiling had changed. Names matter, I told myself. They anchor the room. They tell you where the river bends in the dark. I kept the obituaries open under my hand and watched the clerk record each name for the minutes. The pen did not falter. The stenographer, Ruthie Klein, watched fingers and lips and turned them into ribbon. The clock marked time. The second hand did not skip. If there had been a misprint in the world, it had been corrected for the record. I leaned back and let the city's practical magic wash over the wood. The benches, the lamps, the varnished tables, the heavy curtains that kept daylight in a strict frame. If a room can have a posture, Part 52 held itself like a person who has learned to carry weight without complaint. I thought about the morgue in the basement of a different building, the stainless steel, the coated drawers. I thought about a newspaper page tiled with the small headshots of the newly absent. I thought about duty and about the kinds of debts the law recognizes and the kinds it pretends not to. Kenton touched my sleeve. He thought I looked tired. He wanted me to save my voice for when we needed it. I nodded. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and felt the cold along the metal edges. The judge announced a brief recess before opening statements. The jurors were led toward the door in a quiet line that made the hair at the back of my neck lift. Adrian Coe walked past me. I could have reached out and touched his sleeve. He did not look left or right. Marta Riva's breath fogged in the air for a second. No one else seemed to notice. Jerome Halley's shoes made no sound on the floor. Maybe the floor swallowed it. Maybe the room. I waited until the door closed and until the clerk gathered her cards. Then I stood and stepped into the aisle with the folder clamped under my arm and the names burning like small lamps in my head. I had a simple plan, the only kind that works in a room that insists on its own weather. Verify the identities. Match the faces to the records. Bring it to Kenton with the kind of proof that does not let the eye skate. When the mind refuses to see, paper still has weight. If I could make one other person see what I was seeing, the room would have to answer for itself. That was the rule I had learned in 100 smaller cases. It would be the rule tonight. I would start with the names, then the death notices, then the clerk who had seen too many panels to remember each face. I would make a stack that could not be ignored. Then I would hold it against the wood of the council table and listen to what the room told me back. Part 2, the 13th chair. Recess thinned the room without emptying it. The jurors disappeared behind a door that sighed like an old lung. The clerk stacked forms. Kenton fielded a call near the window, his voice low and ordinary. I moved along the back wall, counting chairs the way you count steps on stairs you have climbed 100 times. 12 in the box. 12 at council tables if you split the benches into equal eyes. And then the extra thing my attention had been circling since I first stepped in. It sat against the paneled wall to the right of the jury box. A wooden chair with a straight back and a seat polished by long use. The finish had worn to a soft sheen where hands would know to grip when standing. It looked like every other chair that had ever served a courthouse, except for the stenciled number at the back crosspiece. 13. The paint was old and pale, the color of paper left in the sun. The number had not been added for a joke. It was the kind of utilitarian mark that outlives the hand that made it. A bailiff noticed where I was looking. He was a broad-shouldered man with a scar that hid in his hairline and a habit of keeping his palms open when he spoke. There was a friendliness to him that came from years of easing nervous jurors through doors. He drifted closer and let his weight rest on one heel. "You like antiques," he said. His voice made it sound like he did too. I asked how long they had kept the spare. He shrugged. "Comes and goes. Some days it is here when we open the door. Some days it is not. If I write it down, it seems to read what I wrote and do the opposite next time." "Old inventory would show it," I said. He tilted his head. "I thought so. We checked last month. There is no such item. There is a note about replacing a broken council chair in 2006, and a purchase of 6 folding seats during a ceiling repair, and that is all." He rubbed the edge of the number with his thumb. Paint did not flake. He smiled without pleasure. "You could take this thing to a lab and it would tell you it was older than the city." He moved off to answer a question from the clerk. I took out my phone and stepped back until I could frame the chair with the jury box in a single shot. The courtroom lights held steady. The lens found focus without hunting. I took the photo and looked at the screen. The chair was there. The grain of the wood. The number like a small verdict. The reflection along the varnished council table caught a slice of the chair as well. In the reflection, where the seat would be, there was the suggestion of a shape. Not a body, not a face. The proportional blur of something at rest. The eye wants to finish what it thinks it knows. I kept my face still and took a second photo at a lower angle. In the reflection, the blur was higher, like a head lifting to listen. In the chair itself, there was nothing. Empty wood. Empty air. The sense that a breath had just been held. The clock on the wall gave a soft hiccup at 3:13 in the afternoon. It did not click or jam. It simply chose not to land on the second that would have turned the minute into a normal thing. Ruthie Klein, still at her machine, stopped rolling her tape for a count that did not exist. Her brow creased as if she had lost a word and then found it again. The second hand twitched and fell back into its circle. The murmur of the room resumed as if nothing had happened. I stepped closer to the spare chair and let my hand hover over the seat. Heat rises from wood that has been sat on. Cold holds in wood that has waited. The air above the seat felt like the air inside a freezer that has been opened for a photograph and then closed again. I crouched and ran a fingertip along the front edge where clothing would wear a rim smooth. A small glint winked in the seam where the seat met the leg. I eased it free. It was a brass tack, the kind used to fasten a leather pad or a cushion that had long since been removed. The head was dulled by age, the shank still sharp. I balanced it on my fingertip and the cold ran up the nail as if the metal had been stored in snow. It was not the shock of a block of ice. It was the kind of cold that leaves the skin thinking about it for a minute after you pull away. I wrapped the tack in a receipt from my pocket and slipped it into my folder. The bailiff came back, saw my attention on the seat, and leaned his forearms on the rail. He told me a story in the tone of a man who does not believe his own superstition but still knows where it lives. He said the chair had followed a case from the old courthouse on Center Street when they moved parts of the calendar to this building. He said it appears when a trial has had trouble seating a box. Trouble could mean jurors who call in sick, jurors who refuse to serve, jurors who lie. He said no one writes that down in the minutes. He said it is a thing you know only after your second decade on the job. I asked if he had ever seen anybody sit in it. He shook his head and then stopped as if revising a memory he did not care to test. People sit everywhere when the court is empty. That one keeps itself. I do not care to find out what happens if I make different. I stood and took one more photo, this time from the aisle where the jurors had filed out. The reflection in the table showed the blur looking back toward the door where they had gone. Not a face, not even eyes, just the geometry of a person holding still. Kenton waved me over. Opening statements would start on time, he said. No surprises from the judge. Lila stood at her table with a page already marked with underlines. The temperature in the room rose back to ordinary. The cold did not leave my fingertip. I rested my palm on the back of the spare chair for a breath and then let go. The number 13 looked tired and patient. I made a plan the way you make a knot that will slide when pulled. During the next recess, I would test the chair. I would place the brass tack back where I found it and see whether the room answered. I would take photographs from angles that would embarrass tricks of light. I would ask the clerk for the oldest inventory list and the oldest photograph of the room that she could produce. If the chair wanted to be counted, it was already counting us. I would count it back. Part 3, a watch that keeps stopping. Hyssop Tower looked like most new wealth looks in Manhattan, which is to say it tried to be invisible by being perfect. The lobby wore stone the color of rainwater and chrome bright enough to shame a mirror. A security desk curved like a smile that had no intention of reaching the eyes. The guard on duty glanced at my badge, matched my name to his screen, and slid a visitor card across as if it might bite. The elevator glided up in a hush that made me aware of the bones of the building. On the 33rd floor, the hallway carpet swallowed footsteps, and the exit signs hummed as if a beehive lived inside their green. A uniform posted at the end of the corridor lifted the tape to let me through. He had the careful face of a man guarding a room that owed the living a good explanation. The battery storage room did not belong in a tower that was otherwise devoted to clean lines and carpet you could fall asleep on. It had cinderblock walls and a concrete floor and a ceiling that looked like a map of some forgotten sea. The smell of it was part metal, part dry dust, part something faintly sweet that made me think of a dentist's tray. Rows of industrial inverters stood like dress-right dress soldiers, each with a small screen offering numbers that meant more to the building than they did to me. The detective assigned to the scene introduced himself and offered me a paper suit. I stepped into it while he talked through the procedural debris. Time of death estimated at 9:17 in the evening, based on body temperature and the witness report of when the alarm first chirped. The victim, Ariel Donnelly, was found face down near the far wall, one arm under her body, one stretched as if she had begun to rise or had tried to hold onto something that was no longer there. No obvious signs of struggle other than a bruise along the jaw that could have been made by a fall. A watch, recovered near the threshold, belonged to the defendant Marcus Vale, who had consulted on a recent security upgrade. The watch had stopped at 9:17. A still photograph of it in the evidence bag showed the minute hand kissing the 9 like a reluctant goodbye. I asked to see the watch. He handed over the bag. It was a solid piece of work, the kind favored by men who expect the world to be rough on their wrists. Through the clear plastic, the crystal carried a smear like a fingerprint dragged through gray, only it was not oil. It had the dull shine of conductive paste, the kind used to ensure good transfer in machines that hate surprises. A chain of small scratches nicked the bezel at 3 equidistant points, as if something had tried to hold the face still. The backplate screws showed a soft twist to their slots. Someone had been inside this machine, or something had. I asked for the surveillance stills. A tech with hair too neat for the hour brought a tablet and swiped through the corridor camera views. Marcus entered the building at 8:41. Shoulders squared, eyes clear. A man walking into an appointment he had made for himself. He exited at 9:26. Between 8:57 and 8:58, the feed dissolved into snow. The text said it had lasted 49 seconds. He said snow like a man who had grown up too late to remember analog television and had learned the word from his father. He swiped back and forth, letting the static play. It was not white and not black and not random. If you have ever watched a crowd clap in unison and then fall out of time and then find the rhythm again, it was like that. White, gray, white, gray, white. A triplet that did not exhaust itself by repeating. He said the encoder had glitched. I said encoders do not learn to count on their own. He shrugged the way people shrug when they hope the shrug will protect their job. I walked the edges of the room, letting the cameras and the tape and the careful prints on the floor tell me where not to stand. The inverters gave off a noise too low to think about directly. You heard it if you stopped hearing everything else. I set my phone on the nearest cabinet and let its microphone listen. The screen drew a line that moved when the hum moved. White, gray, white. Not the sound. The absence in the sound. A pulse that had chosen to sit in the baseline the way a seed sits in soft dirt. Ariel had died near the far wall where the paint had chipped itself into islands. A small scrap of yellow tape marked the patch where her cheek had met the concrete. A print kit had flowered its black powder around that spot. The powder looked like the shadow of a shadow. I crouched and let my head be still enough to feel how the air behaved. The hum found its shape again. White, gray, white. If you listened long enough, the rhythm started to act like a thought. The tech with the tablet pointed to the corner where a shelf had been cleared. He said they had found a legal pad with 12 marks on it, the kind a person makes when keeping count of something they expect will be long. The pad had been bagged. The marks were short and even. At the end of the last line, a 13th slash had been started and stopped. It looked like a hand that had discovered it would not be needed. I asked about chain of custody. He handed me the log. Every piece of paper in a case tells you what a person thought mattered at the time they were writing it. This one was neat, signed, and initialed until the midnight gap where a signature line waited for a pen that had been used on some other form by some other hand. The evidence moved across that hour anyway. The initials on the next page belonged to a night supervisor whose name I knew from an unrelated complaint about boxes left unattended. I felt the familiar tug of ordinary negligence and held it against the foreign pull of what the hum was saying. I asked to see the glove Marcus had worn earlier that week for his site tour. The detective said motive and opportunity were still being assembled into a shape that would stand up in court. He handed me a photograph of a glove with a smear of the same gray paste that had marked the watch. The photograph had been taken in the kind of light that finds detail without making a point. I stood and walked the room again, this time counting under my breath. 12 steps along the north wall, 12 along the south, 10 along the door, 14 along the back. In the far corner, for scuffs in a line at the height where a folding chair might kiss the paint if someone were careless in setting it up. The scuffs were old. The dust that had settled into them tasted metallic on the tongue of a person who had no business tasting dust. I spat into a tissue and folded it away. The detective pretended not to see. In the corridor, I looked at the elevator camera again. The snow hung in its 49 seconds like a sheet. If you counted out loud the way a juror foreman counts the hands in a box, it fit the same triplet pulse. White, gray, white. The count had learned to live in the wires. The count had learned to show itself in machines and in metal and in things that think about time. Marcus Vale's watch had stopped because the room had made a request of it. The request had been simple and without mercy. Back in the lobby, I stood under the chandelier and felt the air. The hum did not come down this far. The building had decided where to keep its secret. Outside, the evening caught itself on the corners of glass and steel and remembered how to be wind. People were going home, carrying their lives in small rectangles or balanced coffee cups or the slate of their faces. The street did not care that a woman had died in a room designed to survive the failure of other rooms. The street had its own arithmetic. I called Kenton and told him about the chain of custody signature that had gone missing at midnight. I told him about the snow that was not random and the hum that would not quit. He told me not to fall in love with a pattern until it bought me dinner. I told him I would bring him the receipt. On my way back to court, I stopped at a supply store and bought a pack of red pencils and a roll of masking tape. The pencils wrote with a hardness that did not smear. At part 52, I marked the names from the obituaries again and added a small arrow next to each, pointing up toward the box where those names had found bodies again. I managed not to look at the spare chair. The room still had its climate set to reasonable. Ruthie Klein checked her tape and cleared her throat as if announcing to herself that she would not let a second skip by just because the clock asked her to. I put the watch into my notes like a small stone and the snow into my notes like a rhythm that knows how to wear shoes. The next step would not be in Hyssop Tower. It would be in the courthouse itself, in the wires and in the clocks and in the devices that make records pretend to be perfect. If the count was moving from room to room, I needed to find where it slept. When the mind refuses to see, the machine still leaves a print. I would look for the print in the place that insisted on calling itself official.
Par 4, voir dire off the dead.
The copy room on the mezzanine sounded like a distant rainstorm. The machine breathed, took a sheet, swallowed, and sighed another into the tray. The obituaries looked wrong against bright new paper, as if the dead had been asked to dress for an office job. I collated them, added the small red arrows I had bought, and stapled each set with the care you give to a file you know will cut your fingers later. Kenton met me halfway down the stairs. He read while walking, the way men read a menu they have already decided to ignore. His lips moved at the names, then stilled. When he reached the dates, he slowed for 2 steps and then recovered the courtroom stride. "I appreciate the effort," he said, polite as a card on a bouquet. "But the panel is seated. If we raise it wrong, we look like we are auditioning for folklore." "Read the faces," I said. I kept my voice level. "Match the photographs to the box." He lifted the top sheet and glanced past the staple. His eyes slid, not in panic, not in denial. They simply declined to catch. He flipped the pages with fingers that handled contracts and confessions without trembling. When he reached the last page, he handed the packet back. "If I do not see it," he said, "Judge Pell will not see it. If Judge Pell does not see it, we both lose the hour we need for opening." He touched my sleeve the way a man touches a friend who is about to step into traffic. "Bring me chain of custody and a witness who bleeds." Down in part 52, the machine of court resumed its motion. The clerk called the room to order, and the room obeyed. I moved to Ruthie Klein's desk at a lull and put one of the obituary copies down where her eye would not miss it. She wore glasses with lenses so clear they seemed not to be there at all. Her hands rested on the machine like a pianist waiting for a familiar entrance. "Could you read back Juror 3's full name?" I asked. "As it appears on your ribbon." She rolled the tape, found the notch she needed, and pressed the foot pedal. Her voice came out through the small speaker, steady and precise, a model of the words she had captured. "Adrian." And then a hollow, not a buzz, not static. A pocket of absence the size of a surname. Felt like stepping onto a stair that should have been there. She frowned, rewound, and tried again. The hollow returned, polite and exact. "Must be where," she said. She adjusted a dial and played the next section. The next name came clean. She stopped, rewound, and the hollow appeared exactly where it had appeared before, honoring the shape of the missing sound. "Let me try 6, I said. She found the line. "Marta." The same hollow, as if some part of the room had developed a habit. Ruthie looked up at me over the rim of her glasses. Her face held the expression of a person who has found a crack in a window and is deciding whether the wind is real. She pressed the pedal again, listened, then lifted her foot. "It has been a long day," she said. She made a small correction on her log and moved her hands to a different posture on the keys, as if a change in stance could cure a change in air. The door at the rear eased open and a man entered, thin as an exclamation, with a folder tucked under one arm and a hat that had seen better heads. He looked at the room as you look at a childhood street you have not walked in 30 years. The bailiff greeted him by name and tone, both generous. Mr. Tedesco, retired clerk. He had come to see a grandson sworn in across the hall. He had wandered in because old habits do not stop at retirement. He saw the chair at the wall and smiled the way people smile at a dog that used to belong to a neighbor. I moved to him and introduced myself. He looked at my badge and the file in my hand and then at the jury box. "You have heard of the cold jury," he said. He did not ask. He stated a weather report. "I have heard a rumor," I said. "Balance? And a room that refuses to close." He nodded. "Back when we were at Center Street, every so often a case would draw the same faces to watch from the rail. They never signed the book. They never spoke. I did not call them ghosts because I liked to sleep. The word in the hallway was, 'A panel got bought once.' The scales did not forgive it. After that, whenever a case smelled like the first, the box would not feel finished. You would seat 12. The room would hold its breath. You would keep wondering who you forgot." He tipped his head toward the 13th chair. "We kept that to make the room behave. It did not always help. But people do better when there is a seat to point at." "Did anyone write it down?" I asked. He chuckled without humor. "You do not write down the parts of the courthouse that refuse to pass audit." I thanked him and watched him go. His shoes made a sound like pencil on paper. I took out the red pencil and drew a small arrow at the bottom of each obituary copy, all pointing to the box like compass needles correcting themselves. When I looked up, Juror 8, Jerome Halley, was staring straight at me. No curiosity, no challenge. Just the steady regard of a man waiting for the count to begin. I held his gaze for a breath too long. He did not blink. When he did, it was as if a switch had been toggled in a machine cabinet. The thermostat on the wall gave a soft click. A moment later, the small display scrolled a number the room did not deserve. 62 degrees. The judge lifted her eyes from her notes. "Maintenance," she said. "Please." The court officer near the door nodded and lifted the phone. The jurors did not rub their arms. Lila did not straighten her collar. Kenton did not notice his breath. I felt the cold creep under my cuffs and across the bones at the back of my hands. The cold was not a temperature so much as a policy. It wanted the body to admit it was in a place that different rules applied. Lila approached the bench for a sidebar and carried the weather with her as if the hem of her suit had collected it. Whatever she said to Judge Pell made the judge's eyebrows draw closer, then ease. The judge looked toward the box and then away so quickly it might have been a blink. The second hand on the clock traveled cleanly across the top of the hour. It did not skip. Not this time. I took the packet of obituaries to the hallway and handed a set to the court officer who had whispered on day one. He read slowly, as if expecting the names to catch fire if he hurried. When he reached Jerome Halley, he made a soft sound in his throat that was not quite agreement and not quite dissent. "I worked a detail on that funeral," he said. "Traffic on Queens Boulevard. The rain started after they lowered the box. I remember because my shoes were new." "You see the match," I said. "I see a resemblance," he said. He handed the papers back as though they might stain. "And I see a panel that has already been sworn." The maintenance man arrived with a tool bag and a practiced frown, did something to the thermostat that seemed designed to let the room save face, and withdrew. The number climbed to 68 and stayed. The relief that followed did not belong to anyone but me. In the quiet before opening statements, I laid the obituary set on Kenton's table and kept one copy for my own pocket. Paper is loyal. I let it warm under my palm. Mr. Tedesco's few words had sketched a shape I knew too well from other work. A present problem with a root in an old proceeding. If the room was balancing an account, I needed the ledger entry that had put the first debt on the page. The rumor had given it a name, the cold jury. It did not give a date. A courthouse does not keep folklore in the front of the file. I would have to ask the archives for something that was never meant for a catalog. I would ask for the case that never sat right. I would ask for a photograph of a room that did not want to be photographed. I would look for a note in a margin that said seat reserved. If a promise had been made on Center Street, Part 52 was still collecting on it. Part 5, The Old Indictment That Never Sat Right. The municipal archives sat a few blocks from the courthouse like a stubborn memory that had refused redevelopment. The lobby smelled of floor wax and old paper, a blend that makes the lungs think in rectangles. I signed the log and gave the clerk a slip with the few facts I had and the many I wanted. Fraud case, late 90s, jury problems, Center Street origin, any references to Caliban Trust. The clerk was a woman whose patience had been shaped by 1,000 researchers who mistook desire for entitlement. She took my request without visible judgment and disappeared into the stacks with the quiet purpose of a surgeon. I found an empty table under a green-shaded lamp and let the hum of fluorescent bulbs settle my head into the rhythm of looking. When the clerk returned, she brought a rolling cart with 4 gray boxes, each tied with cloth tape that made small size when untied. People vs. Caliban Trust sat on the first folder like a simple label on an uncooperative machine. The date line read 1997. The case summary spoke in the dense politeness of prosecutors who prefer numbers to narratives. Charitable fraud. Shell foundations moving money through compliant accounts under the name of civic virtue. A page of organizational charts rendered the scheme into boxes and arrows that looked neat enough to pass for harmless. The minute book told a different story in a different voice, the ink hand that records what happens when people walk into a room and ask the law to be wait. On day 6 of trial, the entry broke its clean lines to admit an interruption. Evacuation due to gas leak reported on 4th floor. Jury removed by officers through west stairwell. Court recessed. When the room reconvened hours later, the language strained to act normal. Jurors accounted for. Counsel present. Judge advises parties. The following morning, the judge dismissed the panel on the record, citing safety concerns and contested communications. The word contested meant something had been said that could not be unsaid but could be denied. The case never receded. A plea negotiation drained the headline from the file. The Caliban Trust paid a fine that did not make the papers happy and did not send anyone to prison. I turned to the juror list. 12 names typed with a machine that had known other indictments. I did not expect to see them. I saw them anyway. Adrian Coe, Marta Riva, Jerome Halley. The names sat there without italics, without accent. The other 9 were strangers to me, but a note clipped to a later memo carried a line that felt like a bruise pressed to see if it still hurt. Deceased, subsequent to mistrial. The dates that followed were scattered across 5 years. No one had written cause of death in a list that was not meant to be a ledger of absence. The handwriting on the note was careful and shy, as if the writer had not wanted to offend the paper by telling it the truth. At the bottom of the first box sat a manila envelope that had been opened and opened again. Inside was a set of photographs from the trial days. Center Street, courtroom 42, if the stamp was to be trusted. The jury box wore the heavy wood of another era. The benches looked just uncomfortable enough to discourage eloquence from the gallery. In one photograph, taken from the counsel table, the jury box was empty and the lights had the faint blur of a long exposure. Against the side wall, slightly out of focus and yet somehow the sharpest thing in the frame, sat a chair with a small painted number on its back. 13. A pencil notation in the margin, the kind clerks make for themselves on days they are not being watched, read, seat reserved. I leaned closer until the grain of the photograph turned into a landscape. The chair had the same straight back, the same worn edge, the same patient posture as the one in part 52. The reflection along the polished counsel table caught the suggestion of a person-shaped emptiness where the seat would be. The eye wanted to finish it. The mind decided not to. I took out my phone, asked permission, and the clerk allowed me to photograph the photograph under the lamp. The image glowed on the screen with the same stubborn softness as the original. I kept going. A bound exhibit list contained a subfile labeled charitable entities, subsidiaries, conduits. The names were the sort of names foundations choose when they want to be invited to luncheons. Everbright Learning, Winterset Arts, Hiram Relief. St. Hiram Caught and Held. I had seen the name on a receipt in a different life. I made a note. A thin packet of memos, dated months after the mistrial, included an internal discussion about whether to reopen the fraud case as a conspiracy with new counts. A line in the margin, half erased, half underlined, Read, if the room will allow. The words did not belong to policy. They belonged to superstition that had learned to dress itself as caution. At the bottom of the fourth box, tucked where thumb and habit hide the pieces that make clerks uneasy, sat a scrap of paper with a line of handwriting that did not match any of the other hands in the file. Deliberations continue until the room is even. No attribution, no date, no instruction about who should decide when even had been reached. I held the scrap under the lamp and the paper showed its age, a slight translucence at the edges like skin that has remembered too much sunlight. I thought about a room counting and refusing to stop because someone had cheated the count. I asked the clerk if I could pull any personnel notes that might explain the gas leak evacuation. She rolled the card away and returned with a thin binder of incident reports that smelled faintly of mildew and rain. The report from that day was brief. Building notified court officers of methane sensor spike on fourth floor. Evacuation protocol enacted. 2 jurors separated from group due to crowding on stairwell but rejoined on landing. A second report, appended a week later, noted an anonymous call received by Chambers warning that a juror had been approached in the hallway days before the leak. The word approached did not admit bribery, but it did not forbid the thought. I copied the juror list and compared the addresses to the obituary database on an archival terminal that felt like it would prefer to be asleep. The matches were not perfect, but they were close enough to make the stomach practice disbelief. Of the 12, 9 had died within 5 years. 1 had moved out of state and left no trace I could gather quickly. 2 had lived, if living means continuing to pay utility bills. And 3 had the same names as the people now seated in Part 52. The file had nothing to say about the 13th chair beyond the photograph and the pencil note. The furniture inventory for the period listed 12 box seats with serial numbers that did not include a superstition. The absence carried its own presence. I asked if there were photographs of the courtroom taken after the move from Center Street. The clerk found one, a glossy that had been made for a brochure. In the shot, the chair did not appear. The varnish on the counsel table carried a long reflection of nothing where the chair would have been. I packed my notes and walked 2 blocks to an office whose windows had seen enough grant applications to develop opinions. Ariel Donnelly's former mentor kept a narrow space with a desk that bowed under neat stacks, a corkboard with polite clippings, and a plant that was trying very hard. She had agreed to give me a half hour because she believed the dead deserved exactly that. Her name was Alma Kirsch. She shook my hand with dry warmth and watched me with the kind of gaze that makes people tell the truth without knowing they have decided to. She was following the money, Alma said. Everyone says that, but in her case it was not a cliché. She had a feel for the way a number can hide inside another number. She came to me 2 months ago with a set of filings that looked like a water wheel. Charity A receives a grant from donor B, immediately disperses to Foundation C, which purchases services from Entity D, which rents space from Caliban Legacy Holdings. Caliban, I said. Alma nodded once. They change their names like people change light bulbs. The wiring stays. Ariel was excited. She was worried. She thought someone would try to make the past not count. Did she say why she was going to Hyssop Tower the week she died? I asked. She said the building listened, Alma said. I told her that was romantic. She said numbers listen. Machines listen. She said if she could get the room to hear the count, the rest would follow. She asked me if I believed in unfinished work. I told her I did. I told her I just did not like it in the dark. I asked if Ariel had ever mentioned Center Street or the old Mistral. Alma frowned at the ceiling until the right memory came down. She had a photocopy of a photograph, she said. A jury box with an extra chair. I told her it was a trick of the angle. She told me sometimes the angle is the point. On my way out, Alma handed me a thin folder of notes Ariel had left with her to be safe. The top sheet was a hand-drawn map of entities with arrows that looked like patient weather. At the bottom of the page, she had written a line I already recognized. Deliberations continue until the room is even. On the back, she had done the thing that mathematicians do when language will not give them shape. She had drawn a balance scale, one pan slightly lower than the other, and a small box labeled 13 sitting on the higher side as if waiting to be placed. The sky had the flat color of an eraser when I stepped outside. The city moved the way it always does when it is not looking at you. I stood on the sidewalk and let the archive dust run out of my lungs. Ariel had been building a lever. The present case was her fulcrum. If the cold jury had been trapped by a decision that never finished, the thing they wanted was not revenge. It was completion. Even. The word sat in my mouth without a definition. Even could mean 12 honest votes. Even could mean one seat finally filled. Even could mean a bench that said the words it had refused to say. I turned back toward part 52 with the photograph of the chair on my phone and the line on the scrap of paper folded into my wallet. The room at Center Street had started a promise. The room on our floor was still honoring it with a stubbornness that felt like duty. If I could find what even meant to the room, I could give the count what it wanted. Then maybe it would let the living out. Part 6, the elevator that refused a floor. By late afternoon, the courthouse grew the fatigue that makes voices fall an octave. The corridors filled with the drag of shoes and the damp wool smell that radiators release when they work too hard. I caught Lila Greystone outside chambers as she slid a file into the crook of her arm and checked her phone with a surgeon's glance. I said we needed to talk in a room that could not pretend to be neutral. She almost smiled at that and then did not. "Evidence locker," she said. "If you waste my time, I will bill you in a currency you cannot spend." The elevator at the end of the hall had a brass trim that remembered when brass was cheap. We stepped in with the efficient choreography of two people who know the other's habits well enough to be annoyed by them. Lila pressed the button marked B for the basement where the chain of custody kept its own office hours. The doors slid shut with the kind of finality you hear in a good closing argument. The car started down. The hum of the cables made the air in the cabin quiver in a register you feel in the soft parts of your teeth. Floor numbers winked in their slot like a patient pulse. Then the panel lights died all at once. The motion stopped with a soft shrug. We hung between floors. The silence that followed was the small, congested kind that makes your body notice itself. Lila reached for the emergency phone, lifted the receiver, and pressed the button that should have found a voice on the other end. The line hummed. It would not ring through. She pressed it again. The hum stayed a hum, like a throat clearing that never decided to speak. I said we would be better served if we listened before we knocked again. She gave me a look that weighed cooperation against pride. Pride sighed and stepped aside. We stood very still. From somewhere in the car, the sound began. A clatter too soft to be a fall, too regular to be imagination. It came like sleet against a tin roof far away, or like the noise of keys striking pews as someone spun a ring around a finger. The hair on my wrists lifted and arranged itself as if waiting for instruction. Lila looked at the panel mirror set above the buttons to satisfy fire code. Frost filmed across its edge with the delicate insistence of handwriting. The letters that formed were not letters. They were bars like tally marks walking toward a count they recognized. 12 in a line and a 13th faint as a thought. I felt for the folded receipt in my pocket and the small weight wrapped inside it. The brass tack from the chair pressed a circle into my palm. Metal holds cold the way a room holds rules. I took out the tack and let it rest on my fingertip. The car breathed the way steel breathes when it adjusts to desire. Lila did not ask what I had. She watched like a woman who had agreed to see something once and would not forgive herself if she blinked at the wrong moment. In the mirror, the frost settled and clarified the way a decision does when you have already made it and are waiting for your body to catch up. The reflection showed more than the two of us. A box of seats filled the space behind us where there was no room for them to be. 12 figures sat with their faces arranged in the posture of people who have agreed to a job. The 13th was an absence with edges that suggested weight. It was not shadow and not light. It was the attention you feel when a quiet person enters a church. Lila's sleeve brushed mine. She breathed in and made the smallest sound that was not language. I said, "Tell me you see them." I kept my voice as soft as you keep a match when you want it to live. "I see frost," she said. And then, after the breath you take when you give up the last comforts of doubt, "I see them." The panel offered a blank where 13 should have been. Elevators in this city often skip the number because the people who ride in them have their own superstitions. This panel had a space, a gap as small as a missing tooth, where a button could have sat. I slid the brass tack into the seam where the panel met the casing. The metal found the slot the way a key finds a lock it was not made for but has been worn into anyway. The car shuddered. Not the panic lurch of failure. The reluctant movement of a machine that has been holding its breath and decides to breathe. The panel lights flickered back, not all at once. The floor indicator blinked, learned its numbers again, and then counted us down without apology. The frost dissolved into a faint wetness that left no trace when I touched it. The reflection in the mirror returned to the two of us and the fluorescent light that makes everyone look like they have already confessed. Lila took her hand off the receiver, which had begun to emit the ordinary, bored voice of a building that thinks emergencies are for tenants who forget their keys. She returned it to the cradle and looked at me with a calculation that included respect and irritation in equal parts. "What did you just do?" she said. "I gave the car the 13th seat," I said. "Or I let it think I did." She nodded once. The expression on her face admitted that the explanation offended her training less than it should have. The doors opened on the basement. The air down there had the smell of cardboard and toner and the soft chemical that keeps old forms from growing anything you do not want to touch. We walked the corridor to the evidence room without speaking. The clerk behind the plexiglass had the heavy eyelids of a man whose shift ends 1 hour after you think it should. Lila showed her identification and asked to review the custody logs on the materials pulled from Hyssop Tower. While he fetched the binders, I studied the red stamp marks on the counter. They formed a slow arch like a tied line. Lila opened the binder and ran a finger down the entries like a harpist coaxing a melody. The midnight gap was still there. The signature that should have bridged the hour had not appeared by clerical miracle. She ordered the supervisor's contact information and wrote it down in tidy capitals. She did not say you were right. She did not need to. Her voice steadied when she asked for the transfer camera footage. The clerk said the recorder had eaten the tape last week. Lila's mouth became a line that could cut. On the way back to the elevator, she paused at a drinking fountain. Her hand rested on the metal lip. She looked at the small puddle that gathers under every fountain no matter how careful people are. "Tell me the rest," she said. "Not the superstition. The structure. What are we looking at?" I told her what the archives had given me. The mistrial at Center Street. The note about a seat reserved. The names that matched and the 9 that died and the 2 that left no trace and the 1 that kept my attention even when I wanted to give it to easier things. I told her about the phrase that had followed me out of the stacks like a polite dog. "Deliberations continue until the room is even." Even, she repeated. She tasted the word like a witness tests the truth before swearing to it, and found it not useless. The elevator doors opened and admitted us with the bland hospitality of a public building. We rode up in silence that felt less like emptiness and more like planning. When the doors parted at our floor, Lila touched the sleeve of my coat and held my eye. "I will verify the chain," she said. "You find the folklore. If this room wants a 13th voice, we will decide which one it gets." The doors closed between us with the softness of a hand held over a mouth. I stood for a moment with the tack burning, a patient reminder inside my pocket, and the memory of the frost count settling along the back of my mind like numbers that add themselves. The corridor lights hummed. The building pretended to be asleep again. Somewhere, 12 figures waited with the patience of people who have been taught by time that it can be taught nothing. I moved toward the stairwell, not because I did not trust the elevator, but because I wanted to feel the honest labor of steps. Part 7, the battery room's hymn. Hyssop Tower after dark keeps its voice low, like a host who does not want to wake the expensive guests. The lobby guard who had checked me in that morning had been relieved by another who looked like he had inherited the silence along with the desk. He examined my badge, found my name again, and waved me through with the grace of a man who has learned that formality is a kind of insulation. The elevator delivered me to 33 with a sigh I felt in my jaw. The corridor lights were dimmed to a compromise between thrift and fear. A maintenance man waited by the tape at the battery room door. He wore a uniform with a name stitched above the pocket that looked older than the shirt. He had the rough hands of someone who had carried engines through tight spaces. "You the one who wanted to hear the room," he said, not mocking and not curious, just setting the terms. I told him I was. He reached under the tape, popped the latch, and let me enter on shoes that had learned to place themselves. Inside, the air held the same dry hum as before, a tone pitched so low the body felt it as pressure rather than sound. The inverters lined the walls like altarpieces, each keeping its own small vigil, each feeding a larger patience. The detective assigned to the case had left a note on the door allowing me 1 hour. That meant I would get 20 minutes if the building decided it had other ideas. I took out my phone, opened the recording app, and set it on the nearest cabinet so the microphone could share the room's breath. Then I stood and did the same thing I had done in the courtroom, which is to say almost nothing. When you stop moving, you give other motions permission to be heard. The hum resolved itself into variation. Some cabinets sat a fraction of a cent higher than others, like singers after a long rehearsal. Beneath the river of sound, the absence began to articulate. White, gray, white. Not in color, not in light. In the way the hum leaned. A triplet that returned to its first step without boredom. I watched the line scrolling across the screen. Every third notch dropped a fraction deeper, like a count nodding off and catching itself. The maintenance man had come in behind me and leaned with one shoulder against the doorframe. He held his hands together like a man about to say a prayer he did not believe in. I asked him how long the hum had been behaving like a metronome with a grudge. He said it began a month ago when a consultant had come through with a folder and a set of opinions about how to protect the building from surge events. He said the consultant tuned the bank to be less forgiving, his phrase, so one spike would not cascade into a blackout. He said it worked if working means less chaos on paper. Who hired him, I asked. The man's mouth tilted as if the name tasted old. He did not know. Someone on a floor with better carpet. He said the consultant wore a suit that forgave him for not being a good person. He said the man laughed without making a sound. What did he call himself, I asked. The maintenance man looked at the row of cabinets and picked the one that seemed most likely to keep a secret. He said the man had told him he knew juries. He had said it like a joke and not like a joke, both at once. The maintenance man shrugged. A gesture that on another person would have been defense, but on him was confession. He wanted the building to behave. He did not care if the word we used for behaving was accurate. I asked if anyone had moved chairs in here. He pointed with his chin to the far wall. I crossed to it and crouched. The scuffs were at the height a chair back would rub if pushed too close. There were 4 in a row that had a similar age, a coincidence of dirt where cleaning could not reach. A rectangle of less dusty floor traced a shape the size of a folding table pulled against the wall and then removed. The trace of the trace. Someone had made a room inside the room, a court inside the heart of the building. The legal pad we had found earlier had been logged and bagged, but the surface where it had rested still carried a slight abrasion where the cardboard backing had rubbed against the paint. If you have handled enough stationery, you know the feel of it in your fingers. It is a kind of proof. I placed my palm on the spot and closed my hand around air. The hum found me again. White, gray, white. Not a haunting. Practice. Security had left another tech at the door to manage my hour. I asked him to bring me the corridor overlays for the past week. He pulled them up on a tablet and explained the color coding with a patience born of long instructions to impatient men. The floors above kept their own lights on for pride. The overlay for the 33rd floor painted a map of motion in slow bleeding trails. 3 nights in a row, in the hour that stretched on either side of 917, Ariel Donnelly's badge had entered this room and left it again. Each time, the trail paused for 1 minute at the threshold and then walked to the back wall and stood still for exactly the length of time a determined person would take to talk herself into doing the same thing again tomorrow. I asked the tech to pull up the exit camera for the same nights. The overlay shimmered and resolved into images of a corridor lit too well to be home and not well enough to be heaven. Ariel moved with the stubborn grace of a person who has been told to stop and has chosen not to. On the first night, she glanced over her shoulder once, as if expecting someone to arrive who did not. On the second night, she did not glance back at all. On the third, she paused with her hand on the door and pressed her thumb to her watch, as if setting a mark in a private record. The maintenance man made the small sound people make when they have been keeping something in their mouths and have decided to spit it out. She asked me if I had folding chairs, he said. I told her I had a dozen. She said she needed them for a test. I told her no tests in the battery room. She promised not to scratch anything. He spread his hands. The scuffs were older than last month, he said. But the chair marks could have been refreshed any time in the past year. I asked if she had been alone. He shook his head once and then twice, revising memory. She arrived alone. That is what I mean when I say alone. Who taught her this room could be used like a courtroom, I asked. He thought about that and arrived at a confession he did not want. The consultant, he said. The one with the folder and the polite shoes. He told her the room listens. He said everything that counts can be made to count louder. He said if she wanted a seat to matter, she should seat it where the metal keeps the score. The maintenance man looked at the inverters and then at me. He said she looked at him as if he had delivered a piece of a riddle without knowing he had done it. I walked the semicircle again with my eyes and imagined chairs unfolded where the scuffs suggested they had stood. The cabinets would have made a low wall. The hum would have given the kind of background that lets votes feel like they occur in a world more permanent than breath. In the corner, a box of rags sat on a shelf dark with oil. Buried under it, the tech had missed a small spiral pad that looked like it had been bought on the way to somewhere else. I flipped to the last page. 12 hash marks, neat as fence posts. A 13th line started with a stroke that lifted before it made meaning. Below the mark, someone had written a single word in a hand that used pressure as punctuation. I slipped the pad into an evidence bag the detective had left on a hook for things no one expected to find after the team had already swept. My phone sang the hum back to me through its tiny speaker. It had learned the rhythm and it did not want to let it go. I lowered the volume until the sound became the suggestion of a sound and stood very still. The wall clock over the door, a cheap thing installed by a contract and left to do its work in anonymity, jittered as the second hand approached 17 past the hour. It did not skip. It hesitated in a way that advertised its ignorance of our concern and then moved on. My chest loosened in a breath I had not earned. I asked the maintenance man if anyone else had been in this room on the nights Ariel visited. He said the security log was clean, but the building was older than its intentions. He said stairwells forget to tell the truth sometimes. He said there had been a man in a gray suit in the lobby on the second night who did not sign in and did not sign out and who left behind the impression of a smile nobody had seen. He said if I asked his supervisor about that, the supervisor would ask me what kind of stories I planned to tell. The room's hum settled into itself, having proved its point. On the cabinet where my phone sat, the screen glow caught the faintest movement of air. A ripple that crawled across the dust the way skin learns to notice when a storm begins far away. I knew what I needed next. Not more numbers. Not more scuffs. A name. Someone who could explain why a room would allow itself to be a jury box of last resort. Someone who had told Ariel that a 13th seat could be assembled from symbols. Someone who thought of law as a machine that can be tricked into remembering what it forgot. I thanked the maintenance man. He nodded as if I had signed something. In the hallway, the building's carpets drank the night back in small sips. I called Lila and left a message without telling her what she should believe. Then I called a number I had not used in years. The chapel on Elm had a sexton who kept better records than any court. If Ariel had learned ritual somewhere, she had not learned it from a consultant's brochure. She had learned it in a room that believed names matter to wood and metal. It was time to ask who had taught her to seat a voice no longer living. I would find the teacher behind the ritual and ask why the city owed a 13th vote. Part 8: Testimony that eats its own tail. Morning brought a courthouse light that made everyone look honest and tired. The gallery filled with the kind of silence that expects to be broken. Lila stood at council table with her notes arranged like a map of a city she already knew by heart. Kenton rubbed his temple once, the gesture of a man who prefers clean fights and keeps finding sand in his shoes. Judge Pell took the bench with a glance at the clock that said she did not trust it to behave. The people called Victor Serrano. He walked to the stand with the self-possession of a courier who had never missed a train. His suit had the modesty of money that knows where it came from. He took the oath with a voice that fit the microphone. He settled in and folded his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Lila began the story she had sharpened. She set the time. She set the place. She set the relationship between Ariel Donnelly and the man in the chair. Serrano said he had worked logistics for the Caliban Group in the late 90s and had since moved into consulting for risk management firms. He said he had met Ariel at a symposium, which he pronounced in a way that made it sound like a private club. He said they had spoken twice, both times about ethics in compliance. His mouth made a generous curve at the word ethics and then went back to the business of surviving questions. Lila asked if he had ever communicated with Marcus Vale. He said they had exchanged messages about a contract at Hyssop Tower. He kept his eyes on the prosecutor and off the defendant the way a man keeps his eyes off an electric fence. He explained his view that Ariel had been, in his polite phrase, overinvested in a narrative about past misconduct at a charity that no longer existed. He said he had tried to warn Marcus that Ariel might misread legitimate precautions as signs of malfeasance. He let the word malfeasance sit there as if it had been freshly lit. He said he never threatened anyone. He said words like never and anyone as if they were immune to the weather. Lila guided him to a point just past safety. Did you ever tell Ms. Donnelly that the room listens? He smiled without teeth. He said he had used a metaphor about systems. He said any room where data accumulates can be nudged to reveal its patterns. He said if she had taken that to mean a ritual, he could not be responsible for what people do with poetry. The gallery shifted. Poetry made everyone nervous. Kenton rose for cross-examination without the making of a show. He carried one folder and a yellow pad that did not need to be there. He began with Serrano's dates, with his job titles, with the neat steps that build a staircase. He asked about the day of the gas leak in '97. Serrano said he had been nowhere near the courthouse. Kenton slid a photocopy across the rail. A memo addressed to a logistics contractor, initials erased by a photocopier that had lived too long. The line that mattered did not come from the body of the memo. It came from a note in the corner written in a tight hand, not unlike Serrano's today. Complete the seating. Serrano looked at the paper and then at the jury and then at the judge. He adjusted his cuff and found his poise again. He said he did not recognize the note. He said phrases migrate. He said it was just a figure of speech. Kenton did not smile. He asked if Serrano had ever used the phrase in relation to a jury that had failed to reach a verdict. Serrano said he was not a lawyer. Kenton asked if Serrano had ever been hired by a law firm to consult on venue conditions. Serrano said he had consulted for firms on building security. Kenton said would that consultation include the movement of people through stairwells. Serrano said he could not speak to the architecture of memory. The stenographer's tape hiccuped. Ruthie Klein lifted a hand and rewound half an inch. The speaker gave a clean playback of the last question. Then it caught the phrase "no further questions" from an earlier afternoon and looped it once, twice, 3 times, like a record that had been taught to stall until the count reached a number it trusted. Ruthie frowned and corrected the feed with a touch that suggested apology to the machine. The courtroom air pressed in around the edges of my ears. Seated behind Kenton, I felt the tack in my pocket give off its thin circle of cold like a coin that had decided it would rather be a clock. Kenton set the memo aside and shifted to smaller ground. He asked about a letter from 1997 addressed to a senior partner at a firm that had represented Caliban entities. He produced it like a man revealing a bandage rather than a wound. The letter, and signed, argued that a tainted deliberation need not end a process if one knew how to carry the practice forward. The phrase "Seat the 13th" appeared as if it were a slogan for a social club. Serrano said he had never written such a thing. He said he did not know who had. He said his concern was always and only safety. Kenton pointed to the margin where a set of initials had once been and were now a ghost. He asked Serrano to write his initials on the pad. Serrano obliged. The curves did what curves do. They matched the ghost well enough to make people concentrate on breathing. Kenton did not push for the confession that would not come. He let the letters sit on the page and went back to the steady climb. He asked where Serrano had been on the 3 nights when Ariel visited the battery room. Serrano said at home. He said his home had doormen who could confirm. He said his phone would show ordinary usages arranged in an ordinary way. Lila objected to the implication that the witness was under suspicion. Judge Pell held her pen for a heartbeat, as if remembering a different bench in a different building. She sustained the objection and then called both counsel to the sidebar. As they approached, the second hand on the courtroom clock reached toward 3:13 in the afternoon and missed it. It did not land. It stuttered once and then again, as if briefly trapped between two small orders. A bloom of white breath lifted from the gallery, as if the room had blown out a candle in a dream. While the muffled conversation at the bench unspooled, I slipped through the little door into the narrow corridor behind it. If I was going to be scolded for it, I would accept the scold. There are moments when the most honest use of your job is to misbehave. The judge's robing room was a cell dressed for a better purpose. The coat rack held 3 hangers, one with the black robe folded as a thing folded after a flame passes near. Beneath the rack, the floor carried specks of wax. Not enough to suggest ceremony, enough to confirm flame. Chalk marked a slow arc on the boards in a semicircle, the kind of mark a person makes to place chairs and then regrets the dust on her cuffs. The mirror above the washstand fogged at the edges, though the air in the room was not damp. A line from shoulder height to the back wall told me the judge had stood here and practiced the words she would need. I looked for matches, for a candle stub, for anything too deliberate to be accident. In the shallow drawer of the stand lay a small tin lid with a bloom of ash inside it. Nothing in a courthouse is truly private. Everything in a courthouse pretends to be. The tin had belonged to the private side of the building and had followed duty across rooms. I stepped back into the corridor and into the courtroom before anyone thought to miss me. The sidebar ended. Lila returned to the lectern with her face set to continue. Kenton sat and wrote a single word in his margin. The word did not need to be legible to mean. Serrano sat with his chin higher than comfort would advise. I watched the jurors. Adrian Coe adjusted his cuff and did not disturb the air. Marta Riva kept her eyes forward until the space between words suggested someone had asked her a question only she could hear. Jerome Halley had the steady look again. The one that is not defiance and not appeal but something in between, as if he were trying to remember the name of a street he had once lived on. The 13th chair against the wall did not change shape. The varnish on the counsel table kept its surface level and patient. In its reflection, for an instant no longer than a blink, I saw the impression of a head turning toward the witness stand. I saw no face. I saw the geometry of attention. Lila asked the last question she could expect to milk. "Did you ever enter the battery room on the night Ariel died?" Serrano said he did not. His voice did not waver. His hands did not perform persuasion. He kept his body still and let the word not float in the air like a truth he had rented for the hour. Kenton said nothing. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let a word sit in the record and see what grows around it. Judge Pell thanked the witness and released him for the moment. She turned to the jury and said the words a bench says when it wants to promise normal weather. The room resumed its regular speed. The clock remembered how to land on the seconds without stuttering. The breath in the gallery turned clear and embarrassed itself for having shown. I sat there with the wax and chalk still on my shoes and the image of the memo in my head. We had not caught Serrano in a confession. We had caught him in a net of habits. He was a man who thought rooms were instruments. He was a man who thought a jury was a mechanism that could be paused and carried. He was a man who had taught Ariel a language for rooms that listen. The record would say he was a witness. The room had marked him as a participant. As court recessed, I slipped back toward chambers, the file under my arm growing heavier in a way paper does when it knows it is part of a story it cannot control. The bench had been used, perhaps knowingly, perhaps through inheritance. The traces said someone had tried to help the room do what the room intended to do. I could feel the next step assemble itself from names and objects. If a 13th voice needed a body, I would have to find the body that did not travel or learn how to build one the room would accept. The chalk on the floor had not been a warning. It had been a draft. Part 9, the juror who remembers being alive. Between the afternoon session and the evening motions, the courthouse goes soft around the edges. Lawyers stand in doorways with their ties loosened half an inch. Jurors cluster near the vending machines like travelers in a terminal that refuses to announce departures. clerks ferry stacks of paper that look light until you try to lift one. I took the long corridor that runs past the restrooms and the stale poster about civic duty. The air there always smells faintly of soap that has lost hope. She was standing where the light from a frosted pane fell in a slow rectangle. Juror 6, Marta Riva, not looking at anything in particular, not lost, not found. Her hands were folded as if she had walked into a chapel without meaning to. Her eyes were open and focused on a distance that had no measurements. I said her name once. Soft, the way you say a name to someone who has just woken and has not decided whether to return to sleep. She did not turn. Her mouth shaped words without sound, as if repeating a line she had learned by heart. We were never let out. I took 2 steps closer and kept my hands visible. Some conversations are like approaching a skittish animal. The wrong angle and you do not get a second chance. Marta, I said, you can hear me. She blinked and the color moved under her skin as if a small lamp had been turned up behind the cheekbones. She turned toward me, slow, the way a person turns when a window opens in a story and fresh air comes in. For a minute, I was not looking at a juror whose obituary sat in my pocket. I was looking at a woman who had left work early once to get to a nephew's school play and who favored shoes that could forgive long walks. The room around us breathed. I am Evan, I said. I work for the defense. I am trying to understand what the room wants. Her mouth tried out a smile it had not used in this decade and let it go. Her voice came rough at first and then steadied, the way a radio clears when the hand on the dial finds the station. We were dismissed by the alarm, she said. That was the shape of the day. But we were not dismissed. Not where it counted. The count was not honest. A box was bought. A hand was paid to sit still. She studied my face as if grading a student she hoped would pass. We could not say the word. We could not say any word that would end it. We walked out and kept walking. But we did not leave. Not the part of us that the room had taken in. She swallowed as if it hurt and continued. The foreman wanted to confess. He carried his ledger like a prayer book. The week after the mistrial, he went to tell it straight and did not make it to the end of the day. Her eyes shifted past me to the door of the women's room as if a memory had ducked inside to wash its hands and would be back in a minute. We have been called to rooms that rhyme with the first. Rooms where the math is the same even if the names change. Fraud in charity clothes. Votes that pretend to be free. We are put in the box and told to remember the rules. We remember. We cannot finish. The bench thanks us. The hallway swallows us. The count remains. The corridor ticked once with the pipe that runs behind the plaster and keeps the building from admitting how old it is. I told her about the 13th chair, about the tack I had taken and put back, about the photograph from Center Street with a pencil note that said seat reserved. Her mouth tightened as if I had mentioned an old injury. He never sat again, she said. The foreman. His name was Nathaniel Brooke. He kept the ledger. He held the weight of us until his hands failed. We have been 12 with a hollow where his vote should be. The room will not accept the echo anymore. It wants a seat that counts. What does even mean, I asked. The line from the archive had been walking in circles in my head. Deliberations continue until the room is even. Define your terms, the law professor inside me said. The hallway did not have a blackboard. She touched her chest with 2 fingers, just above where a necklace would lie. Even means every voice that was promised has been present and has been heard. Even means no purchase has tilted the pan. Even means the foreman does not remain at the threshold with his ledger open to a blank that will not fill. She looked at my hands, not at my face. You can carry a seat when you cannot carry a body. You can bring a voice if you bring the right pieces of it. The ledger, I said. Yes. A token, I said, because all systems want a symbol. Yes. Something that stood for his authority. Something the room recognizes as a tool of order. A gavel that is not performance. A token used to tally. A thing that learned the oil of his hand. And the place, I said, because the room listens to where we put the parts. Her breath fogged once in the air between us. The cold passed and left nothing behind. The bench, she said, or a room that the bench permits to act as a bench. The battery room would do. The building hums like a throat that wants to speak. She closed her eyes briefly, as if remembering a song from a cassette. You will need a pole. Name the 12. Name the 13th. Ask for the word that ends or begins. The voice will come if you give it the path. Who taught you to tell me this? I asked. It did not sound like something a juror learns in the pamphlet that comes with the summons. She smiled again, smaller. It did not belong to the courthouse at all. Time taught me, she said. Waiting taught me. Standing in boxes while the room counted and counted. A man in the corridor once said the chair was there to keep things honest. He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at the varnish on the table as if the wood had asked a question. Serrano, I said. She flinched in the eyes and not in the body. There is always a man who knows how to guide the weather without getting wet, she said. He is not the point. The point is the count. From the courtroom, a bell sounded the way it does when someone finds a file they have been waiting on. A clerk's laugh slid under the door and lost itself in the carpet. Marta looked toward the gallery as if something had tugged her sleeve. Bring him in, she said. Her voice was a little sharper now, the human voice trying to assert itself before the other thing reclaimed the lease. The 13th. Bring his seat. Bring his ledger. Bring the sign that says his hand is present. We can vote. She held my gaze with a fierce ordinariness that made me think of grocery lines and umbrellas and the smell of a hallway after rain. We are tired. We do not mind the work. We mind the waiting. I told her I would find him. Foreman Nathaniel Brooke. Ledger. Token. A place where the room would accept the ritual as lawful even if the law did not recognize it yet. She nodded once, like an officer acknowledging a clear order, and began to turn. Marta, I said, because her name seemed like a rope that might keep her from being dragged under too fast. When this is done, will you be let out? Her smile moved a fraction and held. We are not prisoners, she said. We are jurors. There is a difference. The door opens when the duty ends. She looked past me then, and I knew I had been granted as much clarity as the hour allowed. The color retreated from her face as if a dimmer had been rolled down. Her posture changed by a degree only habit notices. She stepped away, not hurried, not slow, as if she had remembered an appointment she could not miss. When she reached the corner, a court officer pushing a cart of binders stepped aside for her without seeming to register why. She walked through the small door that leads to the panel room, and the door closed as gently as if someone had guided it. I stayed in the corridor with my hand on the cool tile and the word even in my mouth like a coin I had not yet decided to spend. Nathaniel Brooke. Ledger. Symbol. Seat. Pole. The parts began to align themselves into a machine that could be turned by two people who did not fully believe in machines that remember. Lila would resist and then assist. Judge Pell would know more than she had allowed herself to know. The battery room would hum like a choir with its line of absence ready for a final word. On my way back to counsel table, I passed the 13th chair. It had drifted half a foot closer to the jury box. No one had moved it. The varnish on the counsel table showed a reflection of the seat in the place it had been a moment ago, as if the wood's memory ran a second behind the world. I set my hand on the chair back and felt nothing but the careful smoothness that comes from long use. Then, from the pocket where I kept the brass tack, the thread of cold climbed my fingertip like a warning and then settled like a promise. I would find the foreman's remains or, failing that, the relics the room would accept in his stead. The Count had asked. The answer would have to be built. Part 10, the foreman's ledger. Queens keeps its ghosts in daylight. The storefront on 37th Avenue had a roll-down gate stenciled with a name that had not been true for 20 years. Brooke and Sons Bookbindery. The paint had flaked enough to look like a map of small countries. A bell above the door made a thin sound when I pushed in. Paper dust and old glue hit the back of the throat in a way that makes memory feel like work. A man in his 30s rose from a stool behind a long table where a cutting mat sat like a chessboard with its game removed. He had Nathaniel Brooke's mouth, if the photograph in the archive had not lied. A nephew, I thought, before he told me he was a nephew. I am Daniel Brooke, he said. You called about my uncle's things. I held out my card and my reason in the same hand. I told him I was investigating a case that rhymed with one his uncle had not been allowed to finish. He did not smile at rhyme. He looked past me at the light gathering in the dusty window and made a decision I could hear. He led me through a half door into the back where the bindery had once been a place that made deliberate objects out of loose pages. Wooden presses stood like patient animals, teeth missing and still dignified. A flat file against the wall wore labels in the careful hand of a man who expects to outlive his ink. Daniel pulled a drawer and lifted a stack of blue cloth-bound ledgers with a tenderness people usually save for children and instruments. He opened the top one to a page his fingers had learned by heart. The entry marched in a neat line. Dates, names of jurors, the slow drift of the trial like a river across a plain. Then the day of the gas leak. The foreman's hand held steady across evacuation and reconvening. Next page, a short note that crouched at the top as if ready to run. We find. The sentence broke there. No ink followed. The pen had been set down. The crease of the paper suggested the book had been closed in a hurry, and then opened again and then closed as if a ritual of refusal could finish what a building had prevented. Daniel told me his uncle carried the ledger in a bag he did not leave behind even to go for milk. He said the family learned to walk around it the way you walk around a cinder block in the kitchen that no one explains. He did not know what the ledger meant to the old man beyond duty. He knew it had weight. There is something else, he said. He reached into the drawer and produced a small brass token the size of a coin. It had been stamped with a gavel on one side and the words jury foreman on the other with a date worn thin by thumbs. Daniel set it in my palm. The metal had the patient chill of authority. The edges had been worried smooth by a hand that made decisions with it within reach. It felt like a symbol that had not asked permission to be a symbol. Simply was. He held up a cracked piece of leather with a snap closure. Inside, a slot meant for a notepad had been patched in two places with thread that did not match. Tucked into the pocket was a receipt from St. Hiram's Chapel on Elm, the kind printed by a cash register that was proud of its new ribbon in 1997. Donation acknowledged, Nathaniel Brooke. The timestamp read 9/17. The church sold candles on a small table by the door. The receipt could have been for wax. Could have been for anything. The number on it put a cold fingertip under the skin. My uncle ushered there on Sundays, Daniel said. He was the kind of man who needed his hands to have assignments. I asked if there had been a service for the foreman. Daniel nodded. He said the eulogy had been polite and honest, and the room had seemed satisfied in the way rooms try to be when there are casseroles after. He did not know about juries that do not let go. I decided he deserved not to. I told him I wanted to borrow the ledger and the token and the leather case long enough to finish a conversation the old man had started with the city. Daniel looked at my face for signs that I meant harm. He looked at my hands for signs that I would drop what he gave me. He said his uncle had wanted the record to be correct. He said if I meant to correct it without making a show, I could take what I needed and bring it back before his aunt asked questions he did not feel like answering. He wrapped the ledger in paper that had once been meant for expensive books and now served as courtesy. He set the token in a small box where a watch might live and added the receipt without drama. When he placed the box and the ledger in my bag, the shoulder strap dug in as if I had slung a tool instead of paper. I thanked him and promised a brief absence. St. Hiram's Chapel sat on a corner that traffic respected without knowing why. The nave was narrow and clean. The air had the dry calm of a room that has made its peace with time. A sexton who wore his tie like a vow looked up from a clipboard and waited for me to make my request into something he could write down. I asked if there had ever been a pew repair on the right side near the back. He frowned the way men frown at questions that come with their own answer and then nodded. He led me down the aisle past rows of wood rubbed smooth by generations of coats. At the 13th pew end the finial bore a notch the size of a fingernail. It was not a break. It was a deliberate cut in the lacquer, as if a small brass tack had once been pressed into the wood and then pried out by fingers who knew what they were doing. I took the tack from my pocket. The head of it caught a slant of light. I touched it to the notch and it seated with the relief of a word finding its sentence. A chord rose through the wood, too low to name and too steady to be any one noise in the street. The aisle breathed, not a draft, a presence that learns the shape of a room and decides to visit it again. The sexton watched me without interruption, the way a man watches someone repeating a rite he recognizes without admitting to recognition. He said we have replaced many tacks over the years. He said certain ones seem to insist on returning where they were first pushed. He said it is not his business to argue with old decisions in wood. I set the token on the pew end and laid the ledger in the seat as if seating a small and patient person. I said the foreman's name once. Nathaniel Brooke. The sound sat in the chapel and became ordinary, which is the best a name can hope to do. The cord receded into the legs of the pew and the floor and the keeping of the room. I took the tack back, not by force, but by request. It lifted with a small click that made my thumb remember winter. I slid the token back into the box and closed the ledger around its blank where the verdict had waited 28 years. On the chapel's notice board, a list of ushers included Nathaniel's name with a small cross next to it that meant what it always means. The sexton traced the name with the back of a finger and then let his hand fall. Outside, Queens drew its lines under a sky that had found a way to be both gray and bright. I stood on the steps with the bag pulling at my shoulder and the token heavy as a word I had not wanted to say out loud. If a seat could be carried as an assemblage of symbols, I had them. Tack, token, ledger. The chapel had agreed with the courthouse in a dialect older than policy. The foreman did not need to arrive in a body. He needed to be invited in the language of the rooms that had taken his duty away. On the subway back, the car took corners with the patience of a city that has learned to be careful with its own glass. I opened the ledger to the page with the break and let my thumb rest on the sentence that did not finish. We find. The blank after it was not a void. It had been kept on reserve. The tunnel lights slapped past and the paper held steady. In the courthouse, I went first to the empty courtroom and set the ledger on the counsel table next to where the reflection of the 13th chair usually sat. I pinned the brass tack back into the seam of the extra chair, low, where the thumb had found its place. I let the token rest on the seat, a small weight to teach the wood to expect company. Then I called Lila. Night after close, I said. No jury, no gallery. Just us and the judge if she will come and whatever honors remain. We seat the foreman. We poll the box where the building will allow it to be seated. We bring the question to the battery room if we must. We finish what the city owes. She did not say no. She said, tell me what to bring. I said, bring a willingness to say a name like a key. Bring authority. Bring the record. She said she would bring both. With a portable 13th in my bag and a judge who had already drawn a semicircle in chalk, I planned the seating that would either free the room or make it explain itself at last. Part 11, Night Seating. After hours, the courthouse is a ship in dry dock. The lights run thin to save the bulbs. Footsteps sound like decisions. Part 52 waited with the door left on the latch, the way a host leaves a porch light lit for a guest who has promised to come alone. I went in first, bag on my shoulder, the weight of paper and brass lying against the bone. Lila arrived exactly on time, which is to say early for courage and late for doubt. She carried a slim case and the look people wear when they step into a room their training cannot quite authorize. A minute later, Judge Pell slipped in through chambers, robe unfastened at the throat, her hair looser than the day allowed. She set her palm on the back of the first pew as if asking the wood to remember her by name. Counselor, she said to Lila, a greeting and a question. To me, she offered a single nod, the way a bench acknowledges a person who is about to test the limits of good sense. I set the 13th chair nearer to the box, not inside it but close enough for the varnish to catch its outline. The number on the crosspiece had learned this room's light. I pressed the brass tack back into the seam under the seat with my thumb until the metal found its old bite. I placed the foreman's token on the seat, a small sun on a dark lake. Then I opened the ledger and laid it flat on the counsel table where a foreman might rest his hand when he stands to speak. Lila, careful, opened her case. She took out a copy of the current juror roster and a court Bible that had been signed by so many hands it had become a neighborhood. She did not offer it to us. She set it where it could be seen, as if acknowledging that some oaths pass through books like current through wire. Judge Pell drew the blinds half down, cutting the city into a band of sodium across the high panes. Dust rose and hung like a quiet verdict. When she faced the room again, her expression was the public one, practiced into honesty by repetition. Only her hands told the truth. Fingers slightly apart as if keeping time she refused to hear. "We are not conducting a proceeding," she said, to mark a line for the record no one would keep. "We are conducting an act of respect for the record that exists." "No objections," Lila said, and the line steadied. "We worked without ceremony because ceremony can call attention where you do not want it." I placed 12 chairs in a shallow crescent facing the bench, the curve ending one seat short of symmetry. The 13th stood behind the arc like a hinge. The room grew a degree colder in the manner of a quiet intake of breath. "Name them," Judge Pell said. Lila picked up the roster and read, voice even, the way a person reads when she is willing to be believed. Adrian Coe. The air stirred, a light weather, as if a coat had settled onto an invisible back. Marta Riva. The cold deepened a fraction, but this time it came with a human warmth braided through it. Jerome Halley. The wood creaked as if turning to pay attention. She continued through the 12. With each name, the chairs acknowledged the weight they were made for. By the 10th, I could feel a pressure on my eardrums, like standing just beneath singing you cannot quite categorize. When she reached the end, the curve held. It did not close. I stepped closer to the 13th seat, opened the ledger to the page with the rupture, and smoothed it with my hand. The paper had absorbed a lifetime of touching and had learned to lie flat only for the man who had written on it. Tonight, it would have to forgive a substitute. I spoke the name as if I were seating a friend who was always punctual. Nathaniel Brooke. The syllables lived in the air for a beat and then found purchase. A soft click like the settling of a latch you cannot see. The brass token on the seat shifted a hair's width toward the center without the help of any finger in the room. The tack under my thumb cooled, as if remembering weather from a winter before the present calendar. "Say his office," Judge Pell said. Not a correction, an addition. "Foreman," I said. The clock on the rear wall, a municipal object that had no business playing at ritual, offered its hands to 9:17 and hovered there, the second hand twitching in the small pain of decision. The hum in the heating vents took on the triplet rhythm I had learned in another building, white, gray, white. My phone, dead quiet in my pocket, vibrated once. A missed call from a number older than the tower. The box in front of us filled, not with faces, with the geometry of faces, the curve of attention, the way a body alters the air around it when it decides to hold still for duty. In the seat that corresponded to 6, I saw, for a clean second, color run under skin. Marta's chin rose a fraction in acknowledgement, then steadied. Along the arc, heads turned to find one another. People remember how to be together even when they have been told they are done with it. Behind them, the 13th chair took weight. No sound, only a gentle complaint from the joint where leg meets stretcher. A fold in the light formed, the sort you see when a heavy curtain is taught to hang again after storage. I did not look for a face. The room was giving us what it could, and I did not want to spoil its willingness by asking for spectacle. Judge Pell lifted her right hand to shoulder height, not in oath but in greeting. "Jurors," she said, and stopped, the second word she chose with care. "Welcome." The air shifted like a congregation settling after the opening hymn. "What is our mechanism?" Lila asked, returning to terrain she could map. "We cannot invent procedure and call it law. We can borrow form," I said. "We can poll." She nodded, already devising the steps. "We seat the question and ask for individual answers on the record we are making tonight. The record we are honoring," Judge Pell said, "because words bind more than paper." Lila moved to the semicircle and stood where a clerk would stand. Her voice softened, not with pity, with respect. "Juror number 1, she said, facing the first chair. "State your vote in the matter you have carried." A pulse traveled the arc. Not a sound. A gravity, a tilt. The air between Lila's shoulder and the chair warmed, then cooled. She listened the way a person listens with her eyes closed to catch consonants across a bad connection. "Guilty," she said, and wrote the word. The pencil mark looked correct even though no ear had heard it. She pivoted to 2. "Guilty." To 3. "Guilty." The rhythm established itself. At 5 the pressure altered, the tilt lighter. Not, she said. She did not add the rest. The room knew its grammar. A 6, Lila paused. She did not have to. The name did it for her. Marta's presence felt like a hand laid on the edge of a table to steady a cup. Lila waited and then wrote. Hand level, guilty. She glanced toward me as if to share something private. I kept my face calm. This was not about rescue. This was about finish. 7 and 8 answered, the arc rippling after each as a lake keeps its temper in the wind. At 9 there was the impression of a chair, once wood, deciding it was older than it had admitted all day. At 10, not. At 11, guilty. 12 did not respond at once. The second hand twitched toward 17 past and trembled there. The hum in the vent pulled taut, like a string waiting on a bow. Lila waited. Waiting is part of asking. The court teaches that with fines and patience. After a long breath, the change in the air came. Not dramatic. Sufficient. She wrote, guilty. We had a count. 11 to 1. It would not have cleared a box that day. Cleared something older. The 13th, Judge Pell said. Her voice was a bench again, formal not for show but for strength. I went to the seat behind the ark and placed my fingers on the ledger. The blank after we find did not look empty anymore. It looked like a place set at a table for a late arrival. I kept my eyes on the page. Foreman, I said, what say you? The room moved in a way that is hard to describe without sounding foolish. The way a house shifts at night when the heat changes the size of the nails. The way a choir inhales before the note they have all agreed to trust. The brass token lifted and settled as if the seat had shrugged. The blank on the page seemed to darken, not with ink, with intention. Through the hush, far away and close, came Ariel's voice. Not from the ledger, from my bag, where her small spiral pad lay bagged and patient. My phone, perhaps by accident, had woken the playback in the voice notes she had left for herself in the battery room. The sound was barely there, a haunt of a recording drowned in the room's hum. And yet the word came through, as if carried on the building's long breath. Finish. Lila did not flinch. She wrote the 13th line the way you copy a number you have verified twice. She did not write guilty. She did not write not. She wrote, foreman present. It is not a verdict, she said. It is a quorum. Judge Pell stepped down from the bench. She has handed sentences to men who earned them and to men who convinced the world they had not. I watched her place her palm on the 13th chair's back, not pressing, acknowledging. You have been kept, she said, not loudly. You have been patient. The second hand, which had refused to clear 917, suddenly remembered its purpose and fell forward with relief. The temperature in the room rose half a degree, as if the building had permitted the radiators to resume their work. But the weight did not lift. Not yet. The arc of chairs did not empty. Duty seldom releases itself on the first breath. The battery room, Lila said, looking at me and then at the judge. The thing that listens is not here. Judge Pell's mouth compressed. We are not transporting a fiction, she said, but she had already accepted the logic. We are witnessing a record being set right where it was bent. If the instrument is in that tower, we will use it. I closed the ledger and felt the surprising heaviness of the paper, as if it had taken on moisture from a sea no map admitted. I pocketed the token. I eased the tack from the chair and wrapped it in the receipt again, hand remembering the pressure. The impression of bodies in the arc remained, outlines in cool air against warm. Marta turned her face toward us with that small, practical dignity you see in people who keep the line moving. We go now, I said. Now, Judge Pell agreed. Before the day wakes up and decides to be ordinary again. She fastened her robe, a gesture that changed her from witness to instrument. Lila gathered the roster, the Bible, her case, her pen. I took the ledger, the tack, the token. The 13th chair stood where we left it, but its reflection in the varnish showed it an inch nearer the door, as if the wood's memory had decided to follow. We moved through the empty corridors like a small procession that had elected not to tell anyone what it was for fear of being asked to explain. The elevator at the end of the hall waited, doors open, an old courtesy. We stepped in. The panel still lacked a 13, but the seam where the cover met the casing warmed against my pocket. I slid the tack into its hidden notch. The car took us down without pause. No frost on the mirror, only the ordinary face of a building that had agreed, for an hour, to remember the promises it owed. With the 13th voice seated and willing, we would carry the quorum to Hyssop Tower and poll the room that had learned to keep the count. Only there, where power hummed in triplets, could the truth answer to its full name. Part 12, Verdict at Hyssop Tower. Hyssop Tower at night had the look of a lung that chose when to breathe. We came in through a service entrance because doorways have tempers, and this one liked the people who carried tools. The lobby guard gave us the kind of nod you use when the city asks you not to notice. He saw a judge in an unfastened robe, a prosecutor with a case, a man with a bag, and decided we were maintenance with better diction. The elevator rode down a notch in temperature when it learned our floor. The cable hum picked up the triplet I knew, the white-gray-white that had taught itself to travel. Judge Pell stood with one hand braced on the rail as if steadying a step she could not see. Lila watched the panel as though a number might change itself if she stared long enough. I kept my thumb on the brass tack in my pocket. Metal remembers posture. At 33, the corridor lights lay low and long. The maintenance man from earlier waited by the tape like a parishioner who had chosen the late service. He did not ask questions. He lifted the latch and stood aside. Rooms do not open for belief. They open for resolve. Inside, the battery room's hum took us in the way a choir accepts 3 more voices. The inverters kept their vigil. The concrete floor held on to the day's warmth the way a body holds on to duty past comfort. We unfolded 12 chairs in a semicircle by the far wall, aligning the backs to the height of the old scuffs. The line ended a seat shy of symmetry. I brought the 13th to the hinge of the curve and pressed the tack into the seam of its underside until the wood gave the small acceptance sound that old wood gives when you ask it to remember. The foreman's ledger went on a folding table we dragged into place. The brass token sat on the 13th seat, a coin teaching a machine about trust. Lila set the roster down and the court Bible beside it, not for magic, for grammar. Judge Pell loosened her robe and stood at the edge of the circle, an officiant of a church the city pretends it does not have. We waited. Waiting is how you tell a room you are willing to listen to its language. The hum made its absence known every third breath. My phone, in airplane mode because I wanted only one conversation tonight, vibrated once like a weak heart remembering a name. "Jurors," Judge Pell said, and the vents leaned their attention toward her. "You are thanked for answering a call that should never have been placed. We ask now for your poll." Lila stepped forward with the roster. She looked nothing like a priest and everything like a clerk, which is better for truth. "Adrian Coe," she said, and the temperature on my wrist rose a degree. "State your vote." The pressure changed just enough to mean, "Guilty," Lila said, recording what only her body heard. 2, 3, 4. "Guilty." At 5, the tilt lightened. "Not." At 6, a steadiness. The practical patience I recognized from a corridor outside a quiet door. "Guilty," she said, and Marta answered by being present in a way the room could not ignore. 7, 8, 9. "Guilty." 10 again, a catch in the vent before the breath. "Not." 11, a firmness that could support weight. "Guilty." 12 took longer, the hum tightening, the second hand on the cheap wall clock pausing at 17 past as if asking for permission. When it came, the air softened. "Guilty." 11 to 1. It was not a verdict and was everything a verdict needs. The room's geometry shifted. Not release, not yet. Readiness. "The foreman," Judge Pell said. I opened the ledger to the page that cut itself short and set my left hand on its margin. A courtesy to a man who had kept lines straight for a living. "Nathaniel Brooke," I said. "Foreman." The token edged closer to the center of the seat. The 13th chair creaked a private syllable. The humming inverters took on the rhythm that let speech ride a wave. Then the room did something I will never be able to explain in words that would satisfy a conference table. It learned to play back what it had taken in. Lila's phone stayed dark. Mine stayed asleep. Yet the air near the cabinets drew sound out of the metal the way a shell draws a memory of sea. A man's voice, roughened by pleading he did not believe would do any good, leaned into the hum and found shape. "Please," Marcus Vale said, "not to us, not now, but to the past he had already lost. Ariel, do not go down there alone. If Serrano wants to talk, he can talk where cameras work. He is not a friend to rooms." The maintenance man made the sign people make when they do not trust themselves to speak. Lila did not look away from the semicircle. She let the voice pass through her and into the roster. "Do you have more?" Judge Pell asked the air. The air held its breath. The cabinets accepted the answer and returned to hum. "We moved to proof that could be touched." Lila nodded to the maintenance man, who killed one row of overheads with a practical thumb. I took a small alternate light out of my bag, the kind that makes oils honest. We passed it over the surface where the legal pad had once lived, the rectangle we had already found by its abrasion. A smear flared and settled. Not the gray conductive paste, not dust. Ridges. A full thumb imprint riding the corner where a page had been ripped off in a hurry. Ridge detail is only as good as the lift. I pressed a sheet of gelatin tape gently and pulled, careful as a man disarming his own fear. The print came clean, whirls like a map. Lila held an envelope open, and I slid the tape inside. She wrote a name on the flap. Victor Serrano. She did not say why. The room knew how we knew. The man bent toward juries, the courier of arrangements, the consultant who told buildings to listen. I pointed the light at the edge of the breaker panel cover. The screws had a softness to the slots that meant a screwdriver had been invited in more than once by a hand that wanted the metal tired. The maintenance man whispered a date that matched the week Ariel had begun her visits. He had not said it out loud before. He did not relish saying it now. "Seat the foreman in the system," Lila said, already ahead of me. "Give the machine a quorum." I placed the token on the small shelf of the center inverter, where a status light blinked like a tired eye. I leaned the ledger against the panel so that we looked into the room. I pressed the tack into the seam of the breaker door and felt the cold thread up my nail like a wire carrying permission. A breath went through the semicircle, the kind people take before ringing a bell. "Foreman," I said. "Poll complete. What say you?" The inverters fell quiet in a way I could not measure. The hum did not stop, turned as if facing the door. The cheap clock over the threshold fought 9:17 as if it were a superstition and lost, then yielded. The second hand trembled and then settled. In that settling, a woman's voice came up from the floor, through the chairs, in the exact place the legal pads had sat while someone drew 12 marks with a borrowed pen. "Finish it," Ariel said. "Not a ghost. Not a trick." A recorded line from the safety app on her phone, forced loose by the pattern she had taught the room to honor. I heard her breath after the words, the unromantic sound of a person alone in a place she wanted to turn into a forum, realizing that a forum without witnesses is a confession without an answer. The recording died back into the hum, leaving the air warmer in a way heat never manages alone. Lila turned to the table where the pad had been photographed. "Who staged the scene?" she asked, not to me, not to the maintenance man, not to the judge, to the room. "Who cut the camera to snow and told the inverters how to carry a count?" A vibration traveled the cabinets and touched the breaker panel. My light traced the screwdriver scars to a single screw head with a bite missing from the slot, a distinct small gouge. I pulled a plastic envelope from my case and took out a screwdriver recovered from Serrano's office under a warrant so recent the ink on the order could sting. The tool's tip had a corresponding chip. I set it near the gouged screw without touching metal to metal. Lila photographed the marriage no one had planned for. The maintenance man swallowed, said a date he had been afraid to put in his own log, said he had seen a man in a gray suit near the service stair that same night and had not written it because good jobs are lighter than good consciences. Judge Pell held his eye and nodded once. Not absolution, acknowledgement. We did not need blood. We needed weight. Serrano's fingerprint on the pad where the 12 hash marks lived. Serrano's tool matched to the panel. Serrano's phrase complete the seating tucked into old correspondence. Serrano's consultancy at the building in the weeks when the hum learned to count. Ariel's voice telling us what kind of finish the room would accept. I lifted the ledger. I did not write the word the foreman had been denied. I did not have the right, but the page no longer looked like a wound. It looked like a place a book keeps for a leaf that will be added by the bindery when the client returns with funds. Daniel Brooke would know the feeling. Nathaniel would too. The chairs began to ease their claim on the air. You hear it as an absence of pressure, the way a storm lets go of your windows and you realize you had been holding your shoulders wrong. Marta stayed, her presence a little warmer than the rest, as if she were waiting to be certain we had not confused closure with speed. We move to dismiss against Marcus Vale, Lila said quietly to the judge. We move to indict Victor Serrano. We move to admit the ledger as a historical exhibit and the thumbprint as a present tense. Judge Pell's face did not change, because bench faces cannot afford that luxury. But her shoulders settled into a posture that had room for the next hour. We will reconvene at dawn, she said. We will write this in the book the city pays to keep. I pocketed the token. I eased out the tack. The 13th chair at the hinge of our circle creaked once, like a door being closed by a careful hand. The maintenance man looked at the spot where Ariel had stood in his memory and touched his cap to nothing in particular. We left the room as we had found it, except that we had not. The hum welcomed its own noise again, free of burden. The clock forgot to fight the minute and went about its work. In the elevator, the mirror stayed glass. No frost. Our faces, 3 people awake later than policy recommends, looked back with the unhandsome relief of the newly obligated. In the street, the city was beginning its pale rehearsal for morning. Trucks rattled. A newspaper bundle thumped a doorstep. A cyclist took a red light as if it were a dare from a kinder world. We did not speak on the ride back. Lila held the envelope with Serrano's print as if she were carrying an egg from a dare. Judge Pell kept one hand in her robe pocket, fingers worrying something that could have been a coin and could have been nothing at all. I sat with the ledger on my lap and felt the weight redistribute itself in the paper. When we stepped into part 52, the 13th chair was exactly where we had left it, which is to say an inch closer to the box than any photograph would have admitted. The varnish on the counsel table showed its outline again, and for a half-breath the outline looked like an absence with a job. With Serrano exposed by the room that learned to count, the cold jury hovered at the edge of release. But a box does not dismiss itself. That belongs to the bench. Morning would make what we had done lawful, or at least official. The judge would have to speak the words the room had been holding in its mouth for 28 years. Part 13, the judge's hand. Dawn makes a liar out of marble. Part 52 took the early light and turned it into a faint ache on the wood. The gallery half filled with people who had to be there and a few who wanted to say they had. Reporters chose seats near outlets and called it strategy. A court artist unfolded her stool with the practicality of a field medic. The clerk stacked forms with the efficiency of someone who has made peace with paper. The clock behaved as if it had been given a quiet warning. Lila stood at counsel table with a single folder and the envelope that held a thumbprint like a seed. Kenton arrived with Marcus Vale and the expression of a man who has spent the night letting his client be afraid and deciding which part was useful. Marcus's shoulders looked smaller without the presumption of guilt leaning on them. He kept his hands folded, an old habit from security lines and long hallways. Judge Pell took the bench without the ceremonial pause. She glanced once at the 13th chair, which sat against the wall in the place where you put a guest who has stayed longer than manners explain. She faced the room as if it were a road she had driven before dawn many times and could navigate by fence posts and memory. "Call the calendar," she said. The clerk read the caption. People versus Marcus Vale. Battery room. Hyssop tower. A string of numbers that meant nothing to the air and everything to the file. Lila rose and moved to the lectern like a woman approaching a door she had already unlocked. "People move," she began. "To dismiss all charges against the defendant Marcus Vale in the interests of justice and pursuant to newly developed evidence exculpating him and inculpating another." She set the envelope on the rail. "We further move to present to the grand jury an indictment against Victor Serrano for tampering with evidence, conspiracy to obstruct the administration of law, and acts in furtherance of felony fraud." No flourish. No speech about balance or fate. She offered the law the shape it prefers. Nouns and verbs and the minimum of adjectives. Kenton rose with relief carefully disguised as professionalism. Defense consents to dismissal, he said, adding a line the judge did not require and would later be glad she had heard. And concurs in the referral. Judge Pell did not look at the audience, which has a way of changing a judge's face. She let her gaze take in counsel, defendant, and the box, which was already a little more empty than it had been the night before. Her hand found the pen that lived at the top of the bench blotter and rested there. On the motion to dismiss, she said. Granted. She did not let the words sit alone in the room. The record shall reflect that the People's Application cites forensic evidence newly recovered from the scene, including ridge detail consistent with the prints of Victor Serrano on a pad used to mark counts at the relevant time. The record shall further reflect alterations to the breaker panel and surveillance feed consistent with an effort to conceal the movements of the deceased Ariel Donnelly and to suggest the presence of the defendant. She turned slightly, less than the audience could read, toward the 13th chair. The record shall also reflect the admission of a historical exhibit. Lila lifted the blue cloth-bound ledger and carried it to the rail with two hands. She opened to the page whose sentence the city had failed to finish. Kenton stepped forward with a clear sleeve and the chain of custody receipts we had made in cab light and hallway yesterday, clean and correct in the morning. Judge Pell nodded to the clerk. The clerk rose and accepted the book as if it were a fragile instrument loaned by an orchestra. This ledger, Judge Pell said, kept by Foreman Nathaniel Brooke during People v. Caliban Trust, 1997, will be received into the administrative archives of this court and maintained with honors. The court takes judicial notice of the mistrial that followed an evacuation and of credible evidence of improper contact with a juror during that proceeding. Honors. The word came out of her like a stone set in a wall. A few in the gallery shifted as if they felt the wall move. She set down her pen and lifted her eyes to the juror box. The 12 seats were occupied by citizens who had been called for unrelated matters and would never know the way their presence completed a pattern. And then there were the others. I could feel the absence thinning, a lightness that did not read as emptiness so much as satisfaction. Marta Riva sat with her hands folded in her lap. I did not see her face. I felt the permission in the air near her chair, the way you feel the warm side of a stone when the sun has moved on. Jurors, Judge Pell said, and this time she smiled. It altered the room more than the gavel could have. You are thanked. The phrase every panel hears sounded different now. The wood understood it. The carpet understood it. Even the clock, which did not dare fidget at the 17, held still to listen. She continued, not in the formula, but in a plain line that felt older than the bench. You are dismissed with the gratitude of the state. You are dismissed with the gratitude of this court. You are dismissed with the gratitude of the living. A change like a tide moving under piers came up from the floor. Not cold, not heat, relief. One by one, a pressure left the chairs. The varnish on the rail lost the faint tension wood keeps when it is being watched by something it cannot name. The 13th chair gave a small sound, the kind that furniture makes when a weight rises and the joint thanks the craftsman who placed the dowel. Lila watched without pretending not to. Kenton lowered his eyes, because sometimes a man knows not to look directly at an answer he did not ask for. Marcus Vale's breath came out as if the room had allowed it to be called his again. Only one presence lingered, fine as thread in the light above a window. Marta took her time. Perhaps she was making sure the count had no hollows. Perhaps she wanted one more ordinary sight. Judge Pell must have felt it too, because she leaned forward a fraction. You asked us for the record, the judge said softly. It is made. The pressure eased. Something like a nod went through the air, and then the thread was gone. Not out, not away, concluded. Business resumed because the calendar does not forgive poetry. The clerk continued in the voice of a ship's bell. But the room had learned a new habit. When a witness was sworn, the metallic shadow under the vowels was gone. When the clock slid past 9:17, there was no stutter. When a lawyer exaggerated, the echo that sometimes punishes exaggeration failed to arrive. On a bench near the back, Mr. Tedesco, retired clerk, sat with his hat in his lap. He had drifted in for a word with a grandson and stayed for an old promise to be kept. He wiped his eyes with the careless honesty of the old. The bailiff with the scar in his hairline stared at nothing with professional attention. Ruthie Klein checked her machine ribbon and smiled to herself at a tape that had stopped looping the same small phrase each time a name asked for absence. Lila moved to formalize what the room had already decided. "People submit an order on consent," she said, handing up the dismissal. Judge Pell signed without hesitation. The fountain pen made a sound on the paper that the artist captured in graphite like lightning in a bottle. Kenton turned to Marcus, who did not stand yet. It takes a minute to remember how to move when the room releases weight you did not know you were carrying. Kenton touched his sleeve the same way he had touched mine on the first day, and this time the touch did not get pushed back by anything you could not name. There remained one more act, and it belonged to the judge alone. She stepped down from the bench and crossed to the 13th chair. She placed her hand on the back where the number had been worn paler by a century of fingertips. She did not lift it, did not move it, did not turn it into an actor. She spoke to it as though it were a clerk who had stayed late and now needed telling that the ledger was squared. "You have served," she said. "Seat no one unless the scales are broken. And if they are, send for us in daylight." A laugh moved through the gallery, not at the joke, at the permission to breathe like people and not like witnesses to weather. The chair accepted the instruction with silence. The reflection in the council table showed it a hair farther from the box than it had been. Wood remembers, even when it lets go. On the way back to the bench, Judge Pell paused beside me. The robe made a small sound when she moved, the sound a curtain makes in a theater we pretend is a church. "Mr. Mora," she said, "you carry good tools." It was all she would ever say about brass tacks and books that learn to wait. It was enough. She took her seat and addressed the docket. "Next matter," she said, and the clerk obliged. But before the usual work regained its full speed, the judge added a line that did not belong on any form. "Let the minutes reflect," she said, "that a memorial docket is hereby established for interrupted juries and proceedings. The administrative judge will assign a clerk to maintain it, and counsel may apply in writing for appropriate entries. It is not an order. It is a promise." Lila looked at me and then at the box and then at the thin morning window. She would draft the memo before lunch. Kenton would send a note to Daniel Brooke with a copy of the order admitting the ledger, and the note would say what lawyers rarely write down. "Thank you for trusting us." Marcus Vale stood, finally. He did not look toward the gallery to search for a face that would never be there. He looked at the aisle and the door and the strip of light that falls across a man's shoes when he goes free. At recess, the court artist showed me her sketch. The arc of chairs, the judge's hand on the 13th, the ledger open like a mouth about to say we find and deciding to rest instead. She had captured Marta without drawing her, the way a breeze becomes visible in a curtain. When the room emptied for the hour, I stayed behind and listened to the ordinary sounds come back. The vents sighed. The door latches clicked. A copier far down the hall conducted its lonely reign. I put a hand on the 13th chair because goodbyes are how you prove to yourself that you are not inventing closure. The wood was only wood. I stepped into the corridor and found Lila waiting with a paper that looked like any other filing and was not. "Get some sleep," she said, "after you deliver the book." "I will," I said. "After one more question." She nodded. "Ask it where it belongs." The ledger would go home. Then I would carry the quiet to Marta's last station and ask what cost remained. A room can be even and still hold a charge. It was time to cross-examine the silence. Part 14, Cross-Examination of Silence. I took the ledger to Queens before the city had decided how bright to be. Daniel Brooke opened the bindery with the same careful key his uncle had used and listened without interrupting while I gave him the shortest version of a long night. He set the book on the work table as a man sets down a violin after a good performance and a long rest. He touched the blank sentence with the back of one finger and nodded once, as if a page could hear. On the way back, the train spoke in its old iron grammar. I got out 2 stops early and walked to the courthouse because walking makes questions organize themselves. The air had the washed taste the city keeps for mornings after storms that did not quite arrive. Part 52 sat empty between motions. The 13th chair kept its distance from the box like a helpful relative who knows when to leave. I stood at the rail, waiting for the room to choose how it would answer a last inquiry. The clock ticked through its seconds without drama, the hands sliding past 17 with the indifference of a cured habit. In the corridor where the light falls in a reliable rectangle, Marta Riva stood as before, hands folded as if the day had been trimmed to fit her posture. She did not start when I approached. She looked at me with a calm that did not ask for apology. "Thank you," I said. Her smile touched the face the way a small wind touches a curtain. "We are good at the piecework," she said. "What people call haunting is often just unfinished stitching." "There is a thing I do not know," I said. "What remains owed? Not to you, to the Count, to the rooms that learned to keep it." She looked past me toward the courtroom door as if listening for someone collecting a coat. "The ledger is home," she said. The bench spoke. "The docket will remember." That is most of what the work wanted. "Most," I said. "Not all." "Names," she said. "Do not let them collapse into cleverness. Do not let the paper reduce them to a list that only proves a point. Say the names sometimes with no point attached." She tilted her head, a teacher testing whether the student would write it down in the right margin. "And make sure the living know where to stand when a room behaves like a scale." Lila's shoes sounded behind me, the neat rhythm of a person who does not waste strides. She had a motion in her hand and a pen behind her ear. She stopped, acknowledged Marta with a level nod, and spoke as if answering a question we had all heard. "There will be a memorial docket," she said. "Names, dates, the reason a case fell out of its rails, and the steps taken to write it. It will not be sentimental. It will be clear. The administrative judge has agreed in principle. I will push for practice." Marta's gaze settled on her and warmed by a degree. "Good," she said. "We prefer procedure to candles." She looked back at me. "And if someone tells you to trust the weather in a room, ask who taught the room the trick." She lifted 2 fingers to the notch where a necklace would lie and let them rest there. "We were never let out," she said again. But this time the words changed shape as they left her mouth. "We are out." The clock in the hall clicked and then corrected itself so quickly the mistake felt like courtesy. The air held no frost. The brass tack in my pocket gave no pulse. The building had put away its winter. "One more thing," I said. "Not a question, a check. The foreman. Is he satisfied?" She considered the space in front of her as if composing a note. "He is where he belongs," she said. His hand fell where hands fall when the work is folded. She lifted her chin toward the courtroom. "Tell the judge that if the chair returns uninvited, it is a summons, not a suggestion. And tell the officer with the scar to keep his shoes for wet days. He will need them." I smiled despite a night that had not left many smiles in reach. "I will deliver both." She drew a breath that did not cloud. There was a looseness in her shoulders that had not been there in the corridor the day before. It looked like the moment after a knot has slipped and the rope learns to lie flat again. "Do you want a word from us?" she asked. "People like a word." I waited, because a rushed word cannot be kept. "Equity," she said at last. "Not the financial kind, the weight kind." She held my eye. "It is not balance until it stays balanced when you stop looking at it." Lila made a note she would later translate into policy. The elevator at the end of the hall opened and closed for no one, the sound a building makes when it stretches. Judge Pell appeared in the doorway with her robe unfastened, the way you wear a coat when you mean to go right back out. She lifted 2 fingers toward Marta in a salute that belonged to soldiers before it belonged to benches. "The record is made," the judge said. "The clerk will keep the docket. If you have other instructions, give them to him. He is better at obedience than I am." Marta inclined her head without irony. "You are better at mercy," she said. "That is scarce enough." The judge's smile did not reach her eyes and yet made her kinder. "I will accept the compliment only if it becomes true," she said. A cart rattled past with a stack of subpoenas that would have been heavy even if they carried no words at all. Somewhere a copier began its rainfall. The courthouse chose to be a courthouse again. The 13th chair had edged back another inch toward the wall, with settling into the geometry of furniture as if relieved at being demoted. In the varnish of the council table, the reflection of the chair lagged behind by a heartbeat and then caught up, like a person stepping back into line after checking a window for rain. Marta looked at my hands and then at my face, as if checking for a last mistake. "You did not make promises you cannot keep," she said. "Keep the small ones. They are where the weight hides." I wanted to tell her that I would think of her at odd hours when the city's noises sound like arithmetic and the mind tries to reconcile accounts it cannot see. I wanted to say the box had been kinder than the world deserved. I said only, "I will keep them." She stepped into the rectangle of light and paused as if feeling whether it still fit her. She turned toward the panel room door. The motion had no drama. It looked like the start of a shift, the mundane pivot from one task to the next. As her hand reached where the handle would be, the air cupped it. She did not need the handle. "Goodbye," Lila said. "Goodbye," Judge Pell said, almost in the same breath. Marta said nothing. The door opened a fraction, not in wood, in air, and then there was no door, only the ordinary wall and the poster about civic duty that looked less tired than it had an hour ago. I stood there with the quiet that follows a verdict no one reads out loud. The clock kept its barefoot ticks. A clerk laughed down the hall at something small and real. In my pocket, the receipt from St. Hiram's had warmed to body temperature and forgotten what it had been. Lila touched my elbow. "Come on," she said. "There is a motion to write and a memorial to words so clean no politician can smudge it." Judge Pell returned to the bench and fastened her robe. The seam lay straight. At the threshold, I looked back at the 13th chair. It had become a chair again. If it ever wanted to be more, the room would have to ask in daylight. I went to my desk to write the last entry in a file that had behaved like a living thing. Then I would speak to the listener the way I always do when a case has divided by 0 and found a way to rejoin the integers. Final part, when the room is even. I wrote the last entry in the case file the way a man puts a coat on its hanger and squares the shoulders. The sentence I kept circling would not let itself be carved into a flourish, so I left it plain. A verdict is not a sound. It is a weight redistributed. By mid-morning, Lila had the memorial docket in motion. She wrote the title "In the Language Courts Understand" and nothing more. Interrupted juries and proceedings. She sketched the rules with the firmness of a street map. Names, dates, cause of interruption, corrective actions. No adjectives. She walked it to the administrative judge, who read it once, nodded, and called for a clerk with a talent for remembering where promises are kept. Kenton sent a message to Daniel Brooke that a ledger was safely home and now lived in 2 places. In the bindery that smells of glue and patience. In the archive where the city keeps what it is ashamed to forget. Daniel replied with 3 words that weighed more than they looked. "My uncle knew." Judge Pell finished the morning calendar and asked to be assigned to a quiet part for the next term. It was not retirement. It was something like it. She wanted a docket with fewer rooms that behave like weather and more rooms that behave like rooms. The presiding judge said the usual things and the unusual part, which was to thank her for keeping the air honest. Marcus Vale did not leave the courthouse by the grand steps. He preferred a hallway that had learned the trick of forgetting faces at the right time. Before he disappeared into the city, he stopped at the memorial for Ariel Donnelly in the lobby of her building. Someone had placed a photograph and 2 lilies that looked better than they smelled. He set a watch with a new battery beneath the frame, face up. The hands rolled past 9:17 without catching. 2 minutes later, the watch was only a watch. That was the point. The maintenance man from Hyssop Tower signed a new line in his log. A note about screws replaced, panel resealed, and a promise to ask better questions the next time a consultant arrives with a folder and a patient laugh. He underlined the date once and then again for his own sake. In chamber light, the court artist fixed her drawing. The 13th chair no longer crowding the box. The judge's hand resting on wood that had remembered how to be furniture. A suggestion of a woman sitting where 6 sits, not a face, only the posture of someone who has decided her work is finished and will not be tempted back. I walked past part 52 at dusk and let the room look at me the way a lake looks at a swimmer on shore. It held no chill. It held no pressure. It held only the long fatigue of wood and the mutual forgiveness of dust and light. On the council table, the varnish reflected nothing remarkable. The reflection arrived at the same time as the thing itself. That felt like health. Later, in a kitchen that had never asked me to testify, I spoke to the listener I have in mind when a case ends where something else began. I said that balance is not a scale hanging in a museum and admired by schoolchildren. It is the half-second when a room returns to its own gravity and decides to leave the living alone. I said that we will fail again and call the mending justice because the word we want cannot be stapled to emotion. I said that the city does not heal. It stitches. And the stitches hold until the next wound asks for thread. Somnolent Conspiracies signs off. The city's skin stitches, for now, and the air in Part 52 finally breathes. End of story. Thank you for staying with us through the deliberation of the dead. If you've listened this far, you know that Somnolent Conspiracies is not just about ghosts. It's about the echoes of duty, the debts of silence, and the weight that justice leaves behind. Every verdict, every secret, every breath in a cold room. We only find meaning when someone is still willing to listen. If the story held you, if you felt the city pause in your headphones and breathe back, please subscribe, tap the bell icon, and leave a like to keep our courtroom lit and our witnesses heard. Each story we tell is stitched by your attention, your comments, and your shared moments of quiet. And remember, every place where the air feels colder than it should might just be waiting for its record to be set straight. Until next time, keep the lamp low, keep your notes clean, and keep listening. Because here, every shadow has a story, and we'll be the ones to tell it.